Picture this. You're exhausted, cold, and desperate for shelter after days of treacherous medieval travel. You spot the flickering glow of an inn ahead, salvation at last. But what awaits you inside would horrify any modern traveler. You'll share your bed with 3 strangers, hang your clothes in a toilet for cleaning, and dine on maggot-infested food while dodging human waste thrown from upper windows. Welcome to the medieval inn, part hotel, part brothel, part bank, part battlefield. These weren't quaint taverns from fairy tales. They were complex institutions where privacy didn't exist, violence was entertainment, and services came standard with accommodation. Prepare yourself for 105 shocking truths about medieval European inns that will shatter every romantic notion you've ever held about the good old days. 1. The Dung Wall Mystery. Picture walking into a medieval inn, admiring the sturdy walls that have stood for centuries. What you wouldn't realize is that you're surrounded by animal excrement. The construction technique, called wattle and daub, was medieval Europe's answer to durable building materials, but it required an ingredient that would horrify modern sensibilities: fresh animal dung. Master builders would carefully mix wet soil, clay, sand, and straw, then add the crucial binding agent: steaming piles of cow, horse, or pig manure. This wasn't some primitive mistake. It was sophisticated engineering. The organic compounds in the dung created a chemical reaction that made the walls incredibly strong, sometimes lasting over 700 years. Skilled craftsmen knew exactly which animals produced the best building dung, with cow manure being particularly prized for its binding properties. These walls could support multiple stories and were often stronger than modern drywall. The irony is that medieval builders created some of Europe's most enduring architecture using what we'd consider waste, proving that innovation often comes from necessity and available resources. 2. The toilet wardrobe innovation. In the depths of winter, medieval guests discovered an ingenious pest control system that doubled as clothing storage. The garderobe, medieval Europe's version of a toilet, served a shocking dual purpose that would seem bizarre today. Travelers would deliberately hang their finest garments in these toilet chambers, not despite the smell, but because of it. The concentrated ammonia from human urine created a natural pesticide that killed fleas, lice, and other parasites that plagued medieval clothing. This wasn't some accident. It was a deliberate strategy born from desperate necessity. Wealthy merchants would emerge from their stays with clothes fumigated by toilet fumes, considering this a luxury service. The practice was so widespread that the word garderobe literally meant guard the robe, and staff would carefully manage these toilet wardrobes, ensuring proper ventilation to maximize the ammonia concentration while preventing dangerous gas buildup. Modern pest control companies would be amazed to learn that medieval people had essentially created chemical-free fumigation chambers using nothing but human waste and architectural design. 3. Breaking walls, not doors. The phrase breaking and entering carries a literal medieval origin that would surprise modern criminals. In medieval times, thieves discovered that walls were actually easier to breach than doors, leading to an entirely different approach to burglary. While doors were constructed from thick oak planks reinforced with iron bands and massive locks, the wattle and daub walls were relatively soft and could be broken through with simple tools. Experienced criminals would approach an inn at night, feel along the exterior walls to find the thinnest sections, then use knives or small axes to quietly cut through the interwoven sticks and mud mixture. This created a much quieter entry method than trying to force heavy wooden doors or shutters. The technique became so common that owners began adding interior partitions and multiple wall layers specifically to deter wall breakers. Legal documents from the period show numerous court cases involving wall breakers rather than traditional burglars. This medieval crime wave ultimately influenced building codes, leading to regulations requiring stronger wall construction and the development of early security features that prioritized wall integrity alongside door strength. 4. Weaponized toilet architecture. Medieval military engineers turned human waste into defensive weapons through ingenious toilet design that served dual purposes. And garderobes weren't just convenient. They were strategically designed defensive features that could repel attackers through the sheer horror of their contents. These toilets deliberately protruded from exterior walls like small towers, ensuring that all waste would fall directly outside, creating a disgusting barrier around the building's perimeter. During sieges, this design became militarily significant. The accumulated waste created both psychological deterrence and physical obstacles for attacking forces. However, the design also created vulnerabilities. Clever attackers sometimes used toilet shafts as entry points, climbing up through the waste chutes to gain access to upper floors. This led to an architectural arms race, with builders creating increasingly complex toilet defenses, including sharp turns in the chutes, iron gratings, and even deliberate weak spots that would collapse under an attacker's weight. Some inns built masonry walls around toilet shaft exits, creating what amounted to fortified bathroom complexes. The irony is that medieval people had turned bodily functions into military strategy, proving that innovation in warfare could come from the most unexpected sources. 5. The smoky interior strategy. Before the revolutionary invention of proper fireplaces in the 13th century, medieval inns operated under a philosophy that would seem insane today. Everyone should constantly reek of wood smoke. The central fire pit system wasn't just primitive heating. It was a deliberate choice with multiple benefits that made the choking, eye-watering environment actually preferable to alternatives. These massive fire pits dominated in common rooms, with smoke rising through strategically placed holes in the roof, but much of it remained trapped inside, creating a perpetual haze that made breathing difficult and left everyone's clothes, hair, and skin saturated with the smell. However, this wasn't poor design, it was sophisticated survival strategy. The constant smoke acted as natural food preservation, extending the life of stored meat and grains by preventing spoilage and insect infestation. The acrid environment also deterred many insects and small vermin. Travelers accepted the burning eyes and smoke-stained clothing as a reasonable trade-off for warmth and preserved food. And owners carefully managed these fires, knowing exactly which woods produced the most beneficial smoke and how to maintain the perfect balance between heating and preservation. Modern visitors would find these environments unbearable, but medieval travelers considered well-managed smoky inns a sign of quality and safety. 6. Medieval flush technology. Long before modern plumbing, the most advanced medieval inns featured sophisticated flush systems that would impress contemporary engineers. These weren't primitive latrines. They were complex hydraulic engineering projects that demonstrated remarkable technical innovation. Master builders designed intricate rainwater collection systems using carefully angled gutters that captured precipitation from multiple roof surfaces, channeling it through wooden or stone conduits directly to toilet shafts. During rainstorms, these systems created powerful flushing action that cleared waste more effectively than many early modern toilets. Additionally, inn staff operated manual flushing systems, hauling buckets of water from wells or streams to pour down garderobe chutes in massive quantities, creating artificial floods that swept away accumulated waste. The most luxurious establishments featured holding tanks that could store water for flushing during dry periods, requiring sophisticated understanding of water pressure and flow dynamics. Some inns even incorporated seasonal flooding patterns, timing major cleaning operations to coincide with spring floods that would carry away accumulated waste. These systems required constant maintenance and significant labor investment, making them expensive luxury features that only the wealthiest establishments could afford. The engineering knowledge required demonstrates that medieval builders possessed far more sophisticated technical skills than commonly assumed. 7. Foundation engineering wisdom. Medieval inn builders possessed sophisticated understanding of structural engineering that contradicts modern assumptions about their primitive construction methods. The toe-up foundation system demonstrates remarkable foresight and technical knowledge that prevented timber rot through principles still used by modern builders. These stone foundations weren't just random rock piles. They were carefully calculated elevations designed to lift the entire timber frame above ground moisture, preventing the devastating rot that could destroy a building within decades. Master builders understood that direct ground contact would cause even the hardest oak timbers to decay rapidly, so they created elaborate stone platforms that functioned as moisture barriers. The height calculations were precise. Too low and moisture would still reach the wood. Too high and the structure would become unstable. The stones were often fitted together using sophisticated techniques borrowed from cathedral construction, creating foundations that could support multi-story buildings for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that inns with proper toe-up foundations survived 500 to 700 years, while those with inadequate foundations collapsed within 50 to 100 years. This knowledge was closely guarded trade secret among master builders, passed down through apprenticeship systems that maintained quality control across generations. The fact that many medieval foundations still support modern buildings proves the sophistication of their engineering principles. 8. Mathematical travel networks. Medieval emplacement followed precise mathematical calculations that created Europe's first standardized transportation network, remaining unchanged for over 800 years until railways revolutionized travel. This wasn't random in distribution. It was sophisticated logistical planning based on carefully calculated daily travel distances that took into account human endurance, horse capabilities, and seasonal variations. The standard measurement was 1 day's travel, approximately 15 to 20 miles, which accounted for loaded carts, difficult roads, weather delays, and the need to arrive with enough daylight for safety and commerce. Builders used surprisingly accurate distance measurement techniques, employing professional surveyors who calculated optimal locations using primitive but effective tools. The network was so precisely planned that travelers could predict their exact stopping points days in advance, making long-distance commerce feasible and reliable. Local authorities carefully regulated this system, preventing competing inns from being built too close together, which would disrupt the economic balance. The spacing also considered geographical features, river crossings, mountain passes, and forest clearings, integrating natural travel obstacles into the mathematical framework. This medieval transportation grid was so efficient that when railroads arrived in the 1800s, many railway stations were built at former inn locations, proving that medieval engineers had identified optimal travel nodes that remained relevant for centuries. 9. The bed-sharing reality. Privacy as we understand, it simply didn't exist in medieval inns, where strangers routinely shared intimate sleeping spaces in ways that would horrify modern travelers. A typical inn room contained 8 to 12 beds, each designed to accommodate 3 to 4 people, meaning that 30 to 40 complete strangers might sleep in a single chamber. The bed assignments followed complex social protocols that often defied logic. Single women travelers would be placed in beds with married couples, often displacing the husbands to other beds with male strangers. This wasn't poor management. It was deliberate social engineering based on medieval concepts of propriety and safety. Staff acted as sleep organizers, carefully managing bed assignments to minimize conflicts while maximizing capacity. Wealthy merchants might share beds with traveling priests, young nobles with foreign traders, and servants with craftsmen, creating unprecedented social mixing. The beds themselves were large enough to accommodate multiple people without necessarily requiring physical contact, but the intimacy of shared blankets, pillows, and sleeping sounds created bonds between travelers that often lasted years. Some guests formed lifelong friendships or business partnerships based on bed-sharing experiences. The system also created its own etiquette, rules about snoring, movement during sleep, and morning routines that were universally understood across Europe. 10. Sexual hospitality customs. One of the most shocking aspects of medieval culture was the widespread practice of sexual hospitality, where hosts regularly offered female family members to traveling guests as part of standard accommodation services. This wasn't prostitution in the modern sense. It was a complex social custom rooted in hospitality traditions, political relationships, and economic necessity that would be considered criminal today. Saxon kings and noble travelers expected access to daughters of household heads as demonstrations of submission and honor, with refusal considered a serious insult that could provoke political consequences. In families, particularly those hosting nobility, viewed these arrangements as investments in their social standing and economic security. The practice was so institutionalized that travelers' accounts casually mentioned being provided with companionship, as they might mention being given food or fresh horses. Young women and families were essentially commodified as hospitality assets, with their sexual availability factoring into the inn's reputation and pricing. Some families became wealthy through strategic sexual hospitality, gaining political protection, business opportunities, and social advancement through these relationships. The custom varied by region and social class, with different protocols for merchants, nobility, and clergy. This system created complex power dynamics where women's sexual autonomy was sacrificed for family economic survival and social advancement. 11. Rope and bench torture. The poorest medieval travelers endured sleeping conditions that amounted to systematic torture, using the rope and bench system that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. In the cheapest inns, guests couldn't afford beds, so they paid minimal fees to sleep sitting upright on hard wooden benches arranged in rows like church pews. A thick rope was strung horizontally at chest height, allowing exhausted travelers to drape their arms over it for minimal support during the night. Picture dozens of people crammed together on these benches, some leaning forward with their heads resting on their knees, others slouching backward against the rope, all desperately trying to find positions that would allow a few hours of unconsciousness. The physical agony was extraordinary. Backs cramped from sitting all night, arms went numb from hanging over ropes, and legs swelled from being in the same position for hours. Yet this was considered luxury compared to sleeping outdoors, where travelers faced robbery, wild animals, and deadly weather. And operators packed these benches tightly, maximizing profits while providing just enough shelter to keep people alive. Regular rope and bench sleepers developed distinctive physical problems, chronic back pain, arm weakness, and leg circulation issues that mark them as belonging to the traveling poor class. 12. Segmented sleep culture. Medieval and guests practiced a sleep pattern that would seem bizarre to modern people, deliberately waking up in the middle of the night for hours of social activity before returning to sleep. This segmented sleep system divided the night into first sleep and morning sleep, with a wakeful period called the watch lasting 1 to 3 hours around midnight. During these midnight hours, common rooms came alive with activities that seem surreal today. Travelers would light candles and engage in intense conversations, business negotiations, letter writing, prayer sessions, and intimate activities that were impossible during the crowded daylight hours. The darkness created a unique social atmosphere where normal class distinctions temporarily relaxed, and people shared stories, secrets, and experiences they would never discuss during the day. And staff prepared for this pattern, providing candles, writing materials, and light refreshments for midnight activities. The practice was so universal that medieval literature frequently references events happening during the watch, and many important historical decisions were made during these midnight conversations. This sleep pattern wasn't insomnia. It was a natural biological rhythm that allowed for twice-daily dreaming cycles and provided essential social bonding time in an era when privacy was nearly impossible during daylight hours. 13. Social class mixing revolution. Medieval inns created the only spaces in European society where rigid class distinctions temporarily dissolved, forcing nobles, clergy, merchants, and servants to coexist in ways that would have been impossible anywhere else. This wasn't intentional social reform. It was economic necessity that accidentally created revolutionary social mixing. A traveling duke might find himself sleeping next to a cloth merchant, with a monk on his other side and a blacksmith's apprentice at his feet. The confined spaces and shared facilities made pretense difficult to maintain, leading to conversations and relationships that transcended normal social boundaries. These interactions often shocked participants. Nobles discovered that commoners possessed sophisticated knowledge and skills, while lower-class travelers gained insights into political and economic realities previously hidden from them. And meals created particularly dramatic mixing, with elaborate etiquette systems determining seating arrangements that balanced social hierarchy with practical space constraints. The shared hardships of travel, dealing with vermin, bad weather, poor food, and dangerous roads, created temporary bonds that sometimes lasted long after the journey ended. Some of history's most significant business partnerships, political alliances, and social reforms can be traced to chance meetings in medieval inns where social barriers temporarily lowered. 14. Bizarre dining protocols. Medieval inn dining involved elaborate etiquette rituals that combined practical survival strategies with complex social protocols that would seem paranoid and bizarre today. The host taking the first bite wasn't mere politeness. It was life insurance against poisoning, a constant fear in an era when political murder through food was common. Guests were required to wipe their mouths with specific cloths before drinking from shared cups, not for hygiene, but to avoid contaminating communal beverages with food particles or potential poisons. The spitting rules were particularly complex. Guests could spit, but only behind you, never on the table, with specific techniques for discreet expectoration that wouldn't offend table mates. Hand-washing ceremonies occurred multiple times during meals, with elaborate protocols for water sharing and towel usage that reflected both practical cleanliness and social hierarchy. The order of food serving followed strict social rankings, but with complex exceptions for guests, foreigners, clergy, and women that created intricate dining choreography. Conversation topics were carefully regulated, with forbidden subjects including politics, religion, and personal finances, unless specifically introduced by the host. These dining rituals served multiple purposes, demonstrating social sophistication, preventing conflicts, maintaining health standards, and creating structured social interactions in environments where strangers from different cultures and classes were forced to share intimate meal experiences. 15. Fork-free eating reality. The absence of forks in medieval inns created dining experiences that would horrify modern germaphobes, requiring elaborate hand-eating techniques and utensil-sharing protocols that spread diseases and created complex social dynamics. Forks didn't exist in most of Europe until the 14th to 16th centuries, and even then were considered exotic foreign affectations that many people rejected as unnecessary luxury. Instead, travelers brought their own knives, often their only personal eating utensil, and shared them generously with tablemates who had forgotten or lost their own. The knife-sharing etiquette was surprisingly sophisticated, with specific techniques for passing blades safely, cleaning them between users, and managing the single shared knife among multiple diners. Hands serve as primary eating tools, leading to elaborate hand-washing ceremonies before, during, and after meals. The bread served dual purposes as food and eating utensil, with thick slices used as plates called trenchers, and smaller pieces used as spoons to scoop up liquids and small food particles. Communal eating from shared dishes required careful coordination to avoid conflicts, with unwritten rules about taking turns, portion sizes, and polite reaching techniques. The intimacy of sharing food, utensils, and eating surfaces created bonds between strangers that modern diners can barely imagine, but also spread diseases rapidly through in populations. 16. Gender pairing dining system. Around 1455, medieval inns introduced the revolutionary coupling system that forced intimate dining arrangements between complete strangers based solely on gender pairing, creating social dynamics that would be considered inappropriate and potentially dangerous today. This wasn't random seating. It was deliberate social engineering designed to create civilized interactions between men and women while maximizing table efficiency and creating entertaining dinner theater for other guests. And staff would survey arriving guests and strategically pair each gentleman with a lady, regardless of their social status, marital status, or personal preferences, forcing them to share a single cup, plate, and eating space for the entire meal. The system created bizarre situations where married women would be coupled with strange men, while their husbands were paired with other women, leading to obvious tensions, flirtations, and occasionally romantic connections that sometimes ended existing marriages. The shared cup and plate created forced intimacy. Couples had to coordinate every bite and sip, negotiate food preferences, and maintain polite conversation throughout lengthy medieval meals that could last several hours. Some couples found the experience delightful and maintained friendships or business relationships long after their stay. Others found it awkward, uncomfortable, or offensive to their religious or cultural beliefs. The system was eventually abandoned due to complaints from clergy and reports of increased infidelity among married guests. Every bedchamber in medieval inns contained multiple chamber pots that serve as primary toilet facilities, creating sanitary nightmares that would violate every modern health code while providing surprising insights into medieval humor and political expression. These weren't simple containers. They were often elaborately decorated with funny sayings, crude jokes, or images of unpopular political figures, transforming human waste disposal into artistic and political commentary. The pots were strategically placed throughout rooms, beside each bed, near windows, and in corners, ensuring that no guest was ever more than a few feet from toilet facilities. The morning emptying ritual involved in staff collecting dozens of pots and dumping their contents directly out of upper-story windows in the streets below, accompanied by warning shouts like Gardez l'eau, from French, Gardez l'eau meaning watch out for the water. This created daily sewage storms in districts, with pedestrians learning to time their movements to avoid the morning chamber pot emptying schedules. The decorative aspect was surprisingly sophisticated. Skilled potters created chamber pots featuring portraits of political enemies, satirical poems, or crude humor specifically designed to entertain users during their most vulnerable moments. Some wealthy guests brought personal decorated chamber pots as status symbols, with elaborate designs that reflected their personality, politics, or sense of humor. 18. Public latrine nightmare. Medieval and public latrines eliminated privacy entirely, featuring multiple toilet seats arranged side by side, without any partitions, forcing strangers to conduct their most private bodily functions in full view and conversation with others. The largest known latrine in London featured 2 rows of 64 seats each. 128 people could simultaneously use the facilities while maintaining normal conversations about business, politics, and personal matters. This wasn't poor design. It was intentional social space creation that served multiple purposes beyond mere waste disposal. The communal aspect was considered beneficial for health. Medieval medical theory suggested that shared toilet experiences helped balance bodily humors and prevented certain diseases through social interaction during elimination. The latrine conversations often became important business meetings, political discussions, and social networking opportunities that influenced major decisions. And staff carefully maintained these facilities, providing shared cleaning materials, fresh straw for floors, and even reading materials for longer visits. The seating arrangements followed social protocols. Higher status individuals got seats closer to walls or windows, while lower class users occupied center positions. The absence of privacy created its own etiquette system, with rules about conversation topics, eye contact, and personal space that made the experience tolerable for regular users. Modern visitors would find these arrangements completely unacceptable, but medieval travelers considered well-maintained communal latrines a sign of equality and social sophistication. 19. Banking and operations. Medieval innkeepers operated sophisticated financial institutions that rivaled modern banks, providing services that went far beyond simple accommodation to become crucial nodes in international commerce and finance. The most successful innkeepers maintained locked cellars with strong boxes that could store valuable goods for months or years, essentially functioning as safety deposit box facilities for traveling merchants who couldn't carry their entire inventory. These innkeeper bankers developed complex bill of exchange systems that allowed merchants to deposit funds in one city and withdraw equivalent amounts in another, creating early international banking networks that spanned multiple countries and currencies. The trust required for these operations was enormous. Merchants regularly left fortunes worth millions in modern currency with innkeepers they had never met, relying entirely on reputation and recommendation networks. In records show transactions involving exotic goods like silk, spices, precious metals, and gems, with innkeepers taking percentage fees for storage, security, and financial services. Some innkeepers became so wealthy through banking operations that they invested in multiple properties, shipping ventures, and international trade partnerships, essentially evolving from hospitality providers into merchant bankers. The most successful operations maintained detailed ledgers, employed armed guards, and developed sophisticated verification systems for identifying legitimate depositors. This financial evolution made Major and Chain some of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. 20. Damage insurance fees. Medievalians pioneered modern insurance concepts by charging mandatory entry fees or courtesy fees that functioned as damage insurance, protecting an operator from the inevitable destruction caused by rowdy guests, violent conflicts, and accidental fires. These fees weren't optional gratuities. They were required payments collected before guests could even enter the premises, representing early risk management strategies that would influence modern hospitality industry practices. The fee calculations were surprisingly sophisticated, taking into account guests' social status, group size, apparent wealth, and reputation for causing trouble. Wealthy nobles paid higher entry fees because their entourages often included armed retainers who might start fights, while solo merchants paid less because they typically caused minimal disruption. The fees covered expected damages from normal operations, broken furniture from enthusiastic dining, burned bedding from carelessly managed candles, damaged walls from weapons practice, and cleanup costs from various bodily functions that missed their intended targets. And operators maintained detailed damage assessment systems, cataloging typical repair costs and adjusting entry fees accordingly. Some establishments offered damage packages, where guests could pay premium fees for permission to be deliberately destructive, essentially medieval party insurance. The most expensive fees applied during festivals, political gatherings, and other events known to generate violence and property damage. This insurance system allowed inns to maintain profitability despite operating in an era when property damage was considered normal entertainment. 21. Coin bouncing authentication. Medieval inn guards developed the sophisticated technique of coin authentication through bouncing that evolved into the modern concept of bouncers, combining acoustical testing with metallurgical knowledge to detect counterfeit currency in an era when financial fraud was rampant. The testing process involved bouncing suspicious coins off wet wooden surfaces. Genuine silver and gold coins produced distinctive sounds that differed markedly from counterfeit coins made from inferior metals or alloys. Expert guards could identify dozens of different coin types, mintages, and counterfeiting techniques just by listening to the acoustic signatures created during bouncing tests. The wet wood was crucial. Moisture created consistent surface conditions that amplified the subtle sound differences between genuine and fake coins. Guards also observed how coins behaved during bouncing. Genuine coins had predictable bounce patterns, while counterfeit coins with incorrect weight distributions would bounce erratically. This testing system was so reliable that courts accepted bounce test results as legal evidence in counterfeiting cases. The most skilled guard could identify the specific region where counterfeit coins were produced based on the types of metals used and manufacturing techniques revealed through sound analysis. The guard's expertise was so valuable that successful innkeepers paid premium wages to attract the most talented coin authenticators. This bouncing technique eventually expanded beyond coin testing to include general security duties, making these guards the first bouncers in the modern sense. 22. Bed space economics. Medieval inns operated sophisticated pricing structures based on bed space allocation rather than individual occupancy, creating economic models that maximize capacity utilization while generating complex social dynamics among strangers sharing intimate sleeping quarters. A single bed typically accommodated 3 to 4 people, with pricing determined by bed quality, location within the room, and proximity to heat sources rather than the number of occupants. Premium pricing applied to beds positioned closest to fireplaces, near windows for fresh air, or elevated on platforms for status and safety. The bed-sharing economy created its own market dynamics. Guests could negotiate with each other for better positions, pay additional fees to exclude certain types of bedmates, or purchase priority placement that guaranteed specific bed assignments. And operators carefully managed these arrangements, balancing profit maximization with customer satisfaction and conflict prevention. The system created temporary communities within each bed, with occupants establishing sleeping schedules, personal space boundaries, and behavioral rules that would govern their shared experience. Some long-term travelers developed preferences for specific bed positions and would pay premiums to reserve their favorite sleeping arrangements at favorite inns. The economic model was so efficient that some inns achieved 90% capacity utilization rates while maintaining customer satisfaction, proving that forced intimacy could be profitable when properly managed. This bed-sharing system influenced pricing strategies that continued into the early modern period. 23. Institutional investment strategies. Winchester College's massive investment in the Angel Inn, Andover, between 1366 to 1404 represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of institutional investment, revealing the sophisticated financial calculations that made medieval hospitality a preferred investment vehicle for major institutions. The college invested over £400, equivalent to several $1 million today, expecting consistent annual returns of £10, though actual returns varied between £7 to £10 depending on economic conditions, political stability, and seasonal travel patterns. This investment represented diversification strategy for educational institutions that needed reliable income streams to fund operations while protecting capital against inflation and political confiscation. The college maintained detailed financial records showing construction costs, renovation expenses, staff salaries, and revenue streams that provide unprecedented insight into medieval inn economics. The investment decision reflected careful analysis of location advantages, travel route importance, and competitive positioning that would impress modern business schools. College administrators negotiated complex agreements with inn managers, establishing performance standards, maintenance requirements, and profit-sharing arrangements that protected their investment while incentivizing quality operations. The inn provided steady returns for over 40 years, funding student scholarships and faculty salaries while maintaining its capital value. This investment model was copied by other institutions, including monasteries, hospitals, and guilds, creating an early institutional investment market that influenced commercial development across Europe. 24. Women innkeeper wealth patterns. The 10 to 20% of medieval innkeepers who were women typically inherited their businesses after husbands died, then often became among the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in their communities through business acumen that challenged gender stereotypes while operating within restrictive legal frameworks. These women innkeepers developed sophisticated management strategies that often improved profitability beyond what their husbands had achieved, implementing efficiency improvements, expanding service offerings, and building customer loyalty through attention to details that male operators often overlooked. Their success created complicated social dynamics. They wielded enormous economic power while facing legal restrictions that limited their political and social authority. Many became informal community leaders, financing local projects, supporting poor families, and mediating disputes through their economic influence. The wealth accumulation was often spectacular. Successful women innkeepers owned multiple properties, employed dozens of staff members, and maintained investment portfolios that included agricultural land, commercial buildings, and financial instruments. Some became regional power brokers, influencing political decisions through their economic leverage and social connections. However, their success also made them targets for criticism from religious authorities who disapproved of women wielding economic power, and from male competitors who resented their business success. The most successful developed elaborate strategies for protecting their wealth through complex inheritance arrangements, strategic marriages for their children, and political alliances that secured their business interests across generations. 25. International logistics hubs. Medieval inns functioned as sophisticated logistics centers that managed complex international supply chains, providing warehousing, inventory management, and transportation coordination services that were crucial for European commercial development. These establishments weren't just accommodation providers. They were distribution centers that broke down bulk shipments from long-distance traders, stored goods for months while waiting for optimal transport conditions, and organized multimodal transportation chains that connected water, road, and foot traffic. The logistics operations required enormous expertise, and operators needed to understand seasonal shipping schedules, regional demand patterns, currency exchange rates, and political stability factors that influence trade routes. They maintained detailed inventory systems, tracking thousands of items from multiple merchants while ensuring proper storage conditions for different types of goods. Perishable items required immediate redistribution, while durable goods could be stored for months, waiting for favorable market conditions. The coordination challenges were immense, matching supply with demand across multiple cities, arranging transport during specific weather windows, and managing payment systems that often involve complex barter arrangements. Some inns specialized in particular goods, spices, textiles, metals, or manufactured items, developing expertise that made them indispensable partners for merchants working specific trade routes. The most successful logistics inns built networks spanning multiple countries, creating early multinational supply chain operations that influenced commercial development for centuries. 26. Barter service integration. Medieval inns operated complex barter economies that allowed travelers to pay for accommodation and services through skilled labor, entertainment, or goods rather than currency, creating economic systems that would seem chaotic but were actually sophisticated value exchange networks. Traveling minstrels regularly paid for room and board through evening performances that entertained other guests, with an operators calculating entertainment value against accommodation costs using surprisingly precise economic formulas. Skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, or masons could work off their own bills by providing repair services, tool maintenance, or construction projects that improved in facilities. Merchants often traded goods directly for services, with an operators accepting spices, fabrics, tools, or other valuable items at negotiated exchange rates that reflected current market conditions. The barter calculations required extensive knowledge of regional pricing, seasonal demand fluctuations, and quality assessments that made an operator sophisticated business analysts. Some travelers became semi-permanent residents, working seasonally for specific inns in exchange for year-round accommodation and meals. The system created unique opportunities for skill sharing. Guests learned new trades while working off their bills, and operators gained access to specialized knowledge and capabilities they couldn't otherwise afford. Documentation shows that some of history's most successful artisans and merchants began their careers working off in bills, using the experience to build professional networks and develop business skills. This barter integration made inns crucial economic development centers that facilitated knowledge transfer and skill development across European society. 27. Guild conference centers. Medieval inns pioneered the conference center industry by renting private rooms to local guilds for meetings, celebrations, and business events, creating substantial additional revenue streams while becoming central to European commercial and political development. Guild room rentals were highly profitable. These organizations had regular income, predictable meeting schedules, and specific facility requirements that made them ideal long-term customers. And operators developed specialized services for guild events, including catering for specific dietary requirements, securing rooms for private negotiations, and providing facilities for displays of guild products or demonstrations of craft techniques. The guild meetings often involved sensitive business discussions, political planning, and trade secret sharing that required absolute privacy and security, making an operators unwilling guardians of commercial and political intelligence. Some inns became closely associated with specific guilds, earning reputations as centers for particular trades or industries that attracted related businesses and created economic clusters. The guild events also provided entertainment and education for other inn guests, who could observe craft demonstrations, business negotiations, and political discussions that would otherwise be inaccessible. Inn operators often joined multiple guilds themselves, using their insider knowledge to provide better services while building business networks that expanded their commercial opportunities. The guild relationships created year-round revenue stability that allowed inns to invest in facility improvements, staff expansion, and service innovations that benefited all guests. 28. Strict liability origins. Modern hotel strict liability laws originated in medieval England due to widespread fears that innkeepers conspired with highway robbers to steal from guests, leading courts to impose absolute liability on innkeepers for any guest property theft, regardless of circumstances or fault. This legal revolution emerged from practical necessity. Travelers had no choice but to trust innkeepers with their valuables, yet robbery was so common that many innkeepers were suspected of being criminal accomplices. The court decisions were revolutionary for their time, establishing that innkeepers were automatically responsible for guest property losses, even if they personally did nothing wrong and took reasonable security precautions. This legal standard was much stricter than liability rules for other businesses, reflecting judges' recognition that the hospitality industry's unique trust requirements demanded special legal protections. The liability rules created powerful incentives for honest business practices. Innkeepers who wanted to stay in business had to implement sophisticated security systems, carefully screen employees, and often compensate guests for losses even when they weren't personally responsible. Some innkeepers purchased early forms of insurance or formed mutual assistance societies to help cover liability payments. The legal precedents established in medieval cases influenced hospitality law development for centuries, with modern hotel liability standards still reflecting principles first established in medieval courts. The strict liability system ultimately improved industry standards by forcing innkeepers to take guest security seriously while providing legal recourse for travelers who had been victimized. 29. Oxford's murder epidemic. Medieval Oxford operated under murder rates that would make modern war zones seem peaceful, with homicide rates of 60 to 75 per 100,000 residents, 50 times higher than contemporary English cities, and 75% of murderers being university students aged 14 to 21 who treated violence as acceptable conflict resolution. The university environment created a perfect storm of dangerous conditions. Thousands of young men far from family supervision, carrying weapons as status symbols, drinking heavily in numerous taverns, and engaging in academic disputes that regularly escalated to deadly violence. Student gang warfare was common, with different colleges, regions, or nationalities forming armed groups that fought brutal battles in streets and ends over academic disagreements, romantic rivalries, or ethnic prejudices. The Inn District was particularly dangerous because it combined student drinking with the presence of travelers carrying valuable goods, creating opportunities for robbery that often turned fatal. Local authorities were largely powerless because students claimed clerical immunity from secular courts, meaning they could literally get away with murder if they demonstrated minimal religious education. The violence was so normalized that university records casually mentioned students being killed over arguments about philosophical points, unpaid debts, or accusations of cheating at dice games. And operators developed elaborate security protocols to manage student customers, including weapon storage requirements, curfew enforcement, and rapid conflict intervention strategies that sometimes prevented murders but often simply displaced violence to other locations. 30. The brutal murder of Priest John Ford. In 1337, the shocking murder of Priest John Ford revealed the dark intersection of love, politics, and violence that made medieval and dangerous places where personal vendettas played out with deadly consequences. Ford was killed by a knife-wielding gang in London, orchestrated by wealthy noblewoman Ella Fitzpaine, his former lover who had turned murderous when their relationship ended badly. The assassination took place near an inn where Ford had been staying, demonstrating how these establishments became hunting grounds for people seeking revenge against specific targets. Despite multiple witnesses identifying the killers and clear evidence linking Fitzpaine to the crime, she was never prosecuted. Her noble status and political connections made her effectively immune from justice. This case exemplified the brutal reality of medieval justice, where social rank determined legal outcomes regardless of evidence or witness testimony. And operators found themselves caught between competing loyalties, protecting guests while avoiding conflicts with powerful nobles who might demand access to their enemies. The Ford murder became legendary, inspiring cautionary tales about the dangers of romantic relationships that cross social boundaries and the vulnerability of travelers who made powerful enemies. And staff developed informal intelligence networks to warn potential victims about assassination plots, though their effectiveness was limited by the political realities that made some people untouchable regardless of their crimes. The case demonstrated how ins became stages for personal dramas that reflected broader social tensions about power, class, and justice in medieval society. 31. Medieval students' deadly encounters. In 1299, an unknown Oxford scholar finished sex worker Marjorie de Hereford, stabbing her rather than paying for intercourse, then escaping unpunished in a crime that exemplified the deadly violence that made medieval and districts some of Europe's most dangerous places. Student gang violence involving tavern encounters frequently turned fatal, with young men treating murder as an acceptable response to disputes over gambling debts, romantic rivalries, or academic disagreements. The combination of alcohol, weapons, youthful arrogance, and legal immunity created a toxic environment where students regularly killed each other and local residents with minimal consequences. And operators in university towns lived in constant fear of student violence, implementing elaborate security measures that included confiscating weapons, limiting alcohol sales, and maintaining private armed guards to protect staff and other guests. The students' sense of invincibility came from clerical immunity laws that allowed anyone with minimal religious education to claim exemption from secular courts, effectively creating a parallel legal system that rarely imposed serious punishments for violent crimes. These legal protections encouraged increasingly reckless behavior, with students competing to commit the most outrageous acts while avoiding consequences through technicalities and political connections. And staff developed sophisticated early warning systems to identify potentially violent students and protect vulnerable guests, but the sheer volume of dangerous young men made prevention nearly impossible. The student violence problem persisted for centuries, with some university towns resembling armed camps where ordinary citizens lived in fear of educated young killers who faced no meaningful legal consequences for their actions. 32. The Hawkhost Gang's reign of terror. The notorious Hawkhost smuggling gang transformed the Mermaid Inn in Rye into their personal fortress, where they sat at windows carousing with loaded pistols on tables while no magistrate dared to interfere with them, creating one of the most dramatic examples of how criminal organizations took over medieval hospitality establishments. The gang's control was absolute. They used the inn as headquarters for planning smuggling operations, storing contraband goods, and intimidating local officials who might oppose their activities. Their brazen display of weapons and contempt for authority created a reign of terror that extended far beyond the inn itself, affecting the entire surrounding region where law enforcement essentially ceased to function. The inn's strategic location near the coast made it perfect for smuggling operations, with secret passages and hidden storage areas that the gang used to move goods between ships and inland distribution networks. Local authorities were powerless because the gang had superior firepower, political connections, and the tacit support of many residents who benefited from cheap smuggled goods. The gang's occupation transformed the inn from a place of hospitality into a fortress where ordinary travelers were unwelcome and local residents lived in fear. And staff became unwilling accomplices, forced to provide services while knowing that resistance could result in violence or death. The Hawkhusk gang's control lasted for decades, demonstrating how criminal organizations could completely subvert legitimate businesses and turn hospitality establishments into criminal enterprises that operated with impunity. Their story became legendary, inspiring countless tales about the dark side of life, where criminals held more power than legal authorities. 33. Medieval poisoning paranoia. Medieval people lived in constant terror of poisoning, leading to elaborate paranoid precautions as Peter of Abano identified 70 deadly poison substances that could be easily added to food or drink without detection. Persistent rumors claimed that King John was murdered by a Knights Templar member who squeezed toad fluid into his goblet, creating widespread fear that poisoning was a preferred assassination method for political enemies. The poisoning paranoia reached such extremes that wealthy travelers employed food tasters, brought their own cookware, and insisted on preparing meals themselves rather than trusting in kitchens. Some guests demanded that hosts take the first bite of every dish and sip from every cup, creating elaborate dining rituals designed to detect potential poisoning attempts. The fear was justified. Medieval knowledge of poisons was sophisticated, with detailed treatises describing dozens of lethal substances that could be extracted from common plants, animals, and minerals. Arsenic, mercury, nightshade, and various mushroom extracts were readily available and nearly impossible to detect in food or wine, making poisoning an attractive murder method for those with access to victims' meals. And operators developed reputation systems based partly on their perceived trustworthiness regarding food safety, with successful establishments going to extraordinary lengths to demonstrate their commitment to guest welfare. Some inns employed official food tasters or maintained detailed records of ingredient sources to reassure nervous guests about meal safety. The poisoning fears created additional business opportunities for physicians and apothecaries who sold antidotes, detection devices, and protective amulets to paranoid travelers willing to pay premium prices for perceived safety. 34. The Tabard Inn's literary significance. Built in 1307 for the Abbot of Hyde, the Tabard Inn in Southwark became immortalized as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales' starting point, but its real history was far more scandalous than literary legend suggests. Located in the notorious Liberty of Winchester, the inn operated in a legal gray area that attracted pilgrims, criminals, and prostitutes known as Winchester geese, women who worked under church protection in one of medieval England's most infamous red light districts. The inn's strategic location made it perfect for Chaucer's narrative purposes, but also made it a hub for activities that would shock modern readers who know it only from sanitized literary accounts. Prostitution was not only tolerated but officially regulated in Southwark, with the local bishop licensing brothels and collecting taxes from sex workers who operated under church authority. The Tabard's guests included legitimate pilgrims preparing for Canterbury journeys, but also criminals fleeing justice, merchants avoiding taxes, and various social outcasts who found refuge in Southwark's unique legal environment. Chaucer's decision to begin his tales at the Tabard wasn't accidental. He was deliberately highlighting the social mixing that occurred in these morally ambiguous spaces where different classes and professions intersected. The inn's actual operations included providing accommodation for prostitutes and their clients, storing stolen goods for criminals, and facilitating various illegal activities that thrived in Southwark's lawless atmosphere. Modern visitors to Canterbury Tales sites rarely learn that they're celebrating an establishment that was essentially a licensed criminal hub where sex work and outlawry operated under religious protection. Witchcrafting. Keitler's Inn in Kilkenny, Ireland, was founded in 1324 by Alice Keitler, a woman married 4 times with all husbands mysteriously dying, who was tried for witchcraft but escaped to England after inheriting their combined fortunes through what authorities suspected was systematic poisoning. Alice's story reads like a medieval thriller. Each husband died under suspicious circumstances that made her progressively wealthier, with local authorities eventually accusing her of using witchcraft and poison to eliminate inconvenient spouses. Then became her base of operations for what was essentially a serial-killing enterprise disguised as unfortunate marriages, with guests unknowingly staying in an establishment built on the profits of multiple murders. Her trial for witchcraft included charges of preparing poisonous potions, conducting heretical rituals, and maintaining sexual relationships with demons. Accusations that reflected both genuine suspicion about her husband's deaths and typical medieval misogyny that attributed successful women's achievements to supernatural influences. Alice's escape to England with her accumulated wealth demonstrated the practical limitations of medieval justice, where determined criminals with sufficient resources could often evade consequences for even the most serious crimes. The inn continued operating after her departure, but its reputation was forever tainted by association with witchcraft and murder, creating a dark tourism attraction that drew visitors curious about its sinister origins. Local folklore developed elaborate stories about Alice's supernatural powers, ghostly appearances, and hidden treasures buried around the property. The case became one of medieval Europe's most famous witchcraft trials, influencing legal procedures and popular beliefs about women who accumulated unusual wealth through suspicious circumstances. Modern visitors to Keitler's Inn can still see medieval features that date to Alice's ownership, making it one of the few surviving establishments with direct connections to documented medieval criminal activity. 36. The White Hart Inn's body-snatching connection. Edinburgh's White Hart Inn, established in 1516, gained notorious fame by hosting the infamous body snatchers William Burke and William Hare in 1828, who murdered fellow patrons and sold their corpses to Edinburgh Medical School in one of history's most shocking criminal partnerships. While this technically occurred after the medieval period, the inn's medieval origins and the nature of the crimes reflect the dark continuity of violence that characterized these establishments across centuries. Burke and Hare's operation involved luring vulnerable guests to their rooms, murdering them through suffocation, and delivering fresh corpses to medical professionals who paid premium prices for anatomical specimens without asking uncomfortable questions about their sources. The inn's layout facilitated these crimes. Multiple stories with numerous private rooms, back staircases for discreet movement, and cellars where bodies could be temporarily stored before delivery to medical buyers. The case revealed how inns could harbor criminal operations for extended periods, with staff and other guests remaining unaware of systematic murder occurring in adjacent rooms. The medical school's willingness to purchase corpses without investigating their sources demonstrated the moral compromises that characterized early medical education, where scientific advancement justified ignoring obvious criminal activity. Burke and Hare's partnership lasted over a year, during which they murdered at least 16 people while maintaining the pretense of being ordinary and guests engaged in legitimate business activities. The case shocked Victorian society and led to major reforms in medical education and body procurement laws, but also highlighted the ongoing dangers of in life where criminal partnerships could operate with minimal oversight. The White Hart Inn became a dark tourism destination, with visitors drawn to its connection to one of history's most notorious murder partnerships. 37. Shakespeare's possible in graffiti. An unpublished 1640s manuscript suggests that William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and other prominent writers carved their names on tabard and walls, creating literal connections between different periods of English literature and transforming in walls into historical documents. The practice of carving names and messages into in walls was widespread among medieval and early modern travelers, creating informal guest registers that survived long after official records were lost or destroyed. These wall carvings served multiple purposes, marking territory, recording visits, leaving messages for future travelers, and creating permanent connections between visitors and specific locations. And operators generally tolerated or even encouraged graffiti because it demonstrated their establishment's popularity and attracted visitors interested in seeing where famous people had stayed. The most valuable graffiti included dates, personal symbols, or brief messages that helped authenticate the carvings and provided historical context for future researchers. Archaeological investigations of medieval sites frequently uncover carved walls that reveal unexpected connections between historical figures and specific locations. The Tabardins' literary graffiti would have created a pilgrimage destination for writers and readers interested in connecting with their literary heroes through physical spaces. Unfortunately, most medieval graffiti has been lost to demolition, renovation, or deliberate destruction, making surviving examples extremely valuable for understanding social networks and travel patterns. The manuscript survival suggests that some people recognized the historical value of graffiti and made efforts to document it before the physical evidence was destroyed. Modern tourism often focuses on reconstructed or imagined medieval spaces, but authentic graffiti provided direct physical connections to historical figures that no amount of interpretation could replace. 38. Ale goes bad in 2 to 3 days. Medieval ale had no preservatives and spoiled within 2 to 3 days maximum, requiring brewing operations to function like modern bakeries with constant production cycles that never stopped, making fresh ale a daily necessity rather than a luxury beverage. Brewing was essentially continuous, with signs posted outside indicating when fresh batches were available, and regular customers developing sophisticated understanding of brewing schedules to ensure they got the best quality ale. The rapid spoilage meant that operators had to calculate demand precisely. Too little production meant disappointing customers and losing revenue, while overproduction meant dumping spoiled ale that represented wasted ingredients and labor. Ale consumption wasn't recreational. It was nutritional necessity in an era when water supplies were often contaminated and ale provided essential calories, vitamins, and minerals that kept people healthy. The brewing process also killed harmful bacteria that made water dangerous, making ale consumption a practical health choice rather than evidence of medieval alcoholism. Children, adults, and elderly people all consumed ale daily as their primary beverage, with different strengths and flavors available for different age groups and social classes. Brewing operations required significant space, equipment, and expertise, with master brewers commanding high wages and social status comparable to skilled craftsmen in other trades. The constant brewing created distinctive smells, sounds, and activities that made inns easily identifiable from considerable distances, with the aroma of fermenting grain serving as advertising for quality establishments. Travelers learned to recognize signs of good brewing operations and would specifically seek out inns known for superior ale quality, making brewing skill a crucial competitive advantage for successful operators. 39. Alueves dominated brewing until banned. Medieval brewing was overwhelmingly controlled by women called alueves who dominated the industry until systematic discrimination drove them out, culminating in Chester's 1540 ban on women aged 14 to 40 selling ale due to fears they'd use sexual desirability to spread immorality. This wasn't subtle discrimination. It was explicit economic warfare designed to transfer a profitable industry from women to men through laws that had nothing to do with brewing competence and everything to do with gender-based economic exclusion. Alueves had developed sophisticated brewing techniques, customer loyalty systems, and business networks that made them formidable competitors in an increasingly valuable industry that attracted male attention as profits grew. The sexual morality arguments were transparent pretexts for economic takeover. Brewing required no physical strength advantages that would favor men, and women had centuries of experience that made them superior practitioners. Many Aleuves were actually more successful than male competitors, running larger operations, serving higher quality products, and maintaining better customer relationships that generated consistent profits. The discrimination intensified as brewing became more profitable and politically influential, with male-dominated guilds using legal and social pressure to exclude women from an industry they had created and perfected. Some Aleuves fought back through legal appeals, political networking, and business partnerships with men who could provide legal protection, but the systematic nature of the discrimination made resistance largely futile. The economic impact was devastating for many families who depended on brewing income, forcing women into less profitable occupations while transferring their expertise and customer bases to male competitors. The brewing industry's transformation from female-dominated to male-dominated reflects broader patterns of medieval economic development that systematically excluded women from increasingly valuable commercial activities. Modern brewing traditions still reflect techniques developed by medieval Aleuves, though their contributions are rarely acknowledged or remembered. 40. Gong farmers earned premium wages. Medievalians employed gong farmers, waste removal specialists who worked exclusively at night, earned a week's wages per day, but remained socially ostracized despite their crucial role in maintaining basic sanitation that prevented deadly disease outbreaks. Richard the Raker's famous death in 1325, when he drowned in his own cesspit, highlighted both the dangerous nature of waste removal work and the social attitudes that made such death subjects for crude humor rather than workplace safety concerns. Gong farmers commanded premium wages because the work was extraordinarily dangerous, physically demanding, and socially stigmatizing. Few people were willing to do it regardless of compensation, creating labor shortages that drove up prices. The night work requirement wasn't just about reducing odors. It was social necessity that allowed gong farmers to operate without offending polite society that preferred to pretend waste disposal happened magically without human intervention. Despite their high earnings, gong farmers faced systematic social exclusion. They couldn't join guilds, attend churches during normal hours, or interact with respectable society except through carefully controlled commercial relationships. Operators depended completely on gong farmers but treated them as necessary evils, providing services while maintaining social distance that reflected broader medieval attitudes about contamination and social hierarchy. The work required sophisticated knowledge of waste management, urban hydraulics, and public health principles that made gong farmers among the most technically skilled workers in medieval society, despite their low social status. Some gong farmers accumulated substantial wealth through their high daily wages, but couldn't convert economic success into social respectability because of the stigma attached to their occupation. The profession was often hereditary, with families specializing in waste management across multiple generations while remaining permanently excluded from mainstream medieval society. Their essential services made them simultaneously indispensable and despised, creating complex social dynamics that reflected medieval contradictions about necessary but unpleasant work. 41. Ostlers were crucial security staff. Ostlers, stable workers who cared for horses, were among the most important employees in medieval inns, responsible not just for animals, but also equipment security and often serving as the primary defense against thieves, murderers, and other dangerous criminals who targeted traveling guests. These men slept with the animals for warmth and guard duty, making them intimately familiar with every guest's cargo, travel plans, and potential vulnerabilities that criminals might exploit. Their strategic position allowed them to observe suspicious activity, identify potential threats, and coordinate defensive responses that could mean the difference between life and death for vulnerable travelers. Ostlers developed sophisticated knowledge of horse breeds, equipment quality, and regional travel patterns that made them valuable intelligence assets for both legitimate guests and criminal organizations seeking information about potential targets. The best ostlers commanded high wages and considerable respect because their skills extended far beyond animal care to include blacksmithing, leatherworking, weapons maintenance, and informal security consulting that protected in operations. They often knew more about guests' true identities and purposes than the innkeepers themselves, making them crucial witnesses in criminal investigations and valuable allies for travelers seeking information about road conditions or potential dangers. And operators carefully selected ostlers for loyalty and competence because incompetent or corrupt stable workers could expose the entire establishment to robbery, violence, or legal problems. Some ostlers developed networks spanning multiple inns, sharing information about dangerous individuals, stolen goods, and criminal activities that created informal security systems protecting travelers across entire regions. Their combination of technical skills, security knowledge, and social connections made them among the most influential staff members in successful medieval in operations. 42. Ale tasters were elected officials. Each village elected ale tasters, official quality control inspectors who tested an ale for strength, price accuracy, and measure compliance, wielding governmental authority that could make or break in businesses through their quality assessments and legal enforcement powers. Brewsters were legally required to summon ale tasters before selling any new batch, creating formal inspection processes that resembled modern health department regulations but focused on preventing economic fraud rather than safety concerns. The ale tasting position was highly sought after because it provided steady income, social status, and significant political influence over one of medieval society's most important industries. Ale tasters used sophisticated testing methods to evaluate alcohol content, flavor consistency, and brewing technique quality, developing expertise that rivaled professional brewers in technical knowledge and sensory discrimination. Their authority extended beyond quality control to include price regulation, measure verification, and fraud detection that protected consumers from common brewing industry scams involving watered-down ale or short measures. Corrupt ale tasters could destroy honest businesses through false negative reports while protecting incompetent brewers who provided bribes or other incentives for favorable treatment. The election process for ale tasters often involved intense political campaigns because the position provided opportunities for patronage, influence peddling, and economic control that affected entire communities. Some ale tasters developed reputations for exceptional judgment that made their endorsements valuable marketing tools for ambitious brewers seeking to establish quality reputations. The system created accountability mechanisms that encouraged brewing excellence while providing legal remedies for consumers who received inferior product from dishonest or incompetent operators. And operators cultivated relationships with ale tasters through hospitality, political support, and quality consistency that could ensure favorable treatment during crucial inspections. 43. And rakers cleaned human waste from streets. Inns employed rakers who collected excrement thrown from windows into streets, working alongside muckrakers who cleaned animal and human waste while earning premium wages but remaining permanent social outcasts whose essential services were both desperately needed and socially despised. The morning waste collection routine involved systematically gathering human excrement that had been thrown from chamber pots during the night, using specialized tools and techniques to manage materials that modern sanitation workers would consider hazardous waste. Rakers developed sophisticated knowledge of waste management, urban drainage, and public health principles that made them crucial for preventing disease outbreaks that could devastate entire communities. Despite earning wages that exceeded many skilled craftsmen, rakers faced systematic social discrimination that prevented them from joining guilds, attending religious services during normal hours, or interacting with respectable society. The work required physical strength, technical knowledge, and emotional resilience to handle both the disgusting nature of the job and the social contempt that came with it. In districts generated enormous quantities of human waste that required daily removal to prevent health crises, making rakers absolutely essential for urban survival despite their low social status. Some rakers developed entrepreneurial businesses, selling collected waste as fertilizer to farmers who valued human excrement for its nitrogen content and soil improvement properties. The profession was often hereditary, with families specializing in waste management across generations while maintaining detailed knowledge of optimal collection routes, seasonal variations, and customer requirements. Their work schedules were carefully coordinated within operations to ensure efficient waste removal that minimized public health risks, while accommodating the social prejudices that demanded invisible service delivery. The economic value of their services created complex relationships wherein operators simultaneously depended on and despised the people who made their businesses sanitary and profitable. 44. Innkeepers as proto-lawyers. Many successful innkeepers were actually priests, lawyers, or nobles who entered the hospitality profession because of extraordinary profitability that often exceeded income from traditional elite pursuits, bringing sophisticated legal and administrative skills to a management that transformed these establishments into complex business enterprises. The legal expertise proved invaluable for navigating the complex regulatory environment that governed medieval hospitality, including licensing requirements, liability laws, tax obligations, and dispute resolution procedures that could overwhelm less sophisticated operators. Priest innkeepers used their religious authority to provide marriage ceremonies, conflict mediation, and spiritual counseling that attracted customers seeking more than simple accommodation services. Lawyer innkeepers leveraged their legal knowledge to offer contract negotiation, dispute resolution, and legal advice that made their establishments preferred destinations for merchants conducting complex business transactions. Noble innkeepers brought political connections, social credibility, and access to capital that allowed them to create luxury establishments serving high-status clientele who demanded superior facilities and exclusive services. The combination of hospitality income and professional expertise created wealth accumulation opportunities that exceeded what most people could achieve through single career paths, making an ownership an attractive diversification strategy for ambitious professionals. These educated innkeepers often became community leaders, using their establishments as informal meeting places where important decisions were made and social networks were developed. Their success challenged social assumptions about appropriate occupations for educated elites, while demonstrating the economic potential of service industries that many aristocrats considered beneath their dignity. The professional skills they brought to management raised industry standards and created competitive pressures that forced purely commercial operators to improve their services or face business failure. Their establishments often became centers for intellectual and cultural activities that enriched entire communities while generating substantial profits for their sophisticated owners. 45. Inns as literary centerpieces. Inns were crucial settings in medieval literature, most famously in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where the inn served as both departure point and narrative framework that enabled diverse storytelling by bringing together characters from different social classes who would never normally interact. The literary significance extended far beyond simple setting. Inns represented social spaces where normal hierarchies temporarily relaxed, allowing for conversations, confessions, and character revelations that would have been impossible in more formal environments. Chaucer's genius lay in recognizing that inns were among the few places where knights, merchants, clergy, and commoners could believably interact as equals, creating narrative opportunities for social commentary and character development. Medieval writers used in settings to explore themes of hospitality, justice, morality, and social change because these establishments embodied contradictions and tensions that characterized broader medieval society. The inn's role as temporary community allowed authors to experiment with social relationships, moral dilemmas, and character interactions that reflected contemporary concerns about class mobility, religious authority, and economic change. Literary inns often featured supernatural elements, ghosts, demons, or miraculous events that reflected popular beliefs about liminal spaces where normal rules didn't apply and extraordinary things could happen. The storytelling tradition that developed around inns influenced oral culture, with real travelers sharing tales inspired by literary examples and creating feedback loops between literature and lived experience. In-scenes provided opportunities for comic relief, romantic encounters, and dramatic confrontations that advanced plot development while entertaining audiences with familiar settings and situations. The literary tradition helped establish inns as cultural institutions worthy of artistic attention and social analysis, elevating them from purely commercial enterprises to symbols of human community and social complexity. Modern readers often understand medieval and culture primarily through literary sources, making works like the Canterbury Tales crucial historical documents that preserve social attitudes and cultural practices. 46. Minstrel and entertainment hubs. Medieval inns were primary venues for traveling minstrels, bards, and storytellers who performed for mixed audiences while serving as news carriers, historians, and cultural ambassadors who spread information, entertainment, and artistic traditions between regions separated by vast distances and poor communication systems. These entertainers created symbiotic relationships with operators, providing evening entertainment that attracted customers and extended stays while receiving free accommodation, meals, and often additional payment from satisfied audiences. The entertainment quality varied enormously, from sophisticated court musicians performing for noble guests to amateur storytellers sharing local legends with common travelers, creating diverse programming that appealed to different social classes and cultural backgrounds. Minstrels served crucial information functions, carrying news about political developments, economic conditions, weather patterns, and social events that helped travelers make informed decisions about routes, timing, and business opportunities. The performance traditions that developed in settings influenced broader cultural development, with songs, stories, and artistic styles spreading across Europe through traveling entertainer networks that connected urban and rural communities. And entertainment often included audience participation, dancing, singing, and storytelling contests that broke down social barriers and created shared experiences among strangers from different backgrounds. The most successful entertainers developed regular circuits, returning to favorite inns on predictable schedules that created anticipation and customer loyalty while providing steady income for both performers and operators. Some entertainers specialized in particular venues or regions, developing intimate knowledge of local preferences, cultural sensitivities, and social dynamics that made their performances more effective and commercially successful. The entertainment tradition created cultural exchanges that influenced language development, artistic styles, and social customs as ideas and practices spread through performer networks that crossed political and linguistic boundaries. And entertainment represented one of the few forms of mass media available in medieval society, making these establishments crucial for cultural transmission and social cohesion across diverse European populations. 47. News and information networks. Before newspapers existed, inns served as primary information distribution centers where traveling merchants, pilgrims, and minstrels shared news from distant lands, making these establishments crucial nodes in medieval communication networks that connected isolated communities with broader European developments. The information exchange was remarkably sophisticated, with experienced travelers developing expertise in evaluating source credibility, cross-referencing multiple accounts, and distinguishing reliable news from rumors and propaganda. And operators often served as informal news coordinators, collecting information from multiple sources and sharing consolidated reports with guests who could carry verified news to other destinations. The news networks facilitated commercial decision-making by providing information about market conditions, political stability, weather patterns, and transportation challenges that influence trade routes and business strategies. Political news traveled rapidly through in networks, with major events like wars, royal deaths, or succession disputes spreading across Europe faster than official government communications. Religious news was particularly important, with information about pilgrimage sites, religious festivals, and church policies spreading through networks that connected monasteries, cathedrals, and religious communities. The quality of information varied dramatically depending on source credibility and transmission accuracy, with some news remaining reliable across multiple retellings, while other stories became increasingly distorted through repeated sharing. Guests developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating news quality, including cross-referencing multiple sources, questioning witnesses directly, and assessing the political motivations of information providers. The news distribution system created competitive advantages for operators who earned reputations for providing accurate, timely information that helped guests make better travel and business decisions. Some inns became recognized centers for particular types of information: political intelligence, commercial news, or religious updates, attracting customers who valued access to specialized knowledge networks that could influence their success. 48. Community gathering places for all classes. Unlike modern establishments that cater to specific social classes, medieval inns brought together people from many walks of life: knight, prioress, monk, merchant, man of law, Franklin, creating unprecedented opportunities for cross-class interaction that challenged social hierarchies and facilitated cultural exchange. The social mixing wasn't accidental. It was economic necessity that forced different classes to share the same spaces because alternative accommodation options were limited or non-existent for travelers. These interactions often produced surprising results, with nobles discovering that commoners possessed valuable knowledge and skills, while working-class travelers gained insights into political and economic realities typically hidden from them. The shared hardships of travel, dealing with bad weather, dangerous roads, uncomfortable accommodations, and unreliable food, created temporary bonds that transcended normal social divisions and encouraged mutual assistance. Conversations frequently led to business partnerships, romantic relationships, and political alliances that would have been impossible within normal social structures that kept different classes rigidly separated. The mixing created educational opportunities for all participants, with farmers learning about international trade, merchants gaining insights into agricultural practices, and nobles discovering the practical challenges faced by common people. Some inns developed reputations as particularly good places for cross-class networking, attracting guests who specifically sought opportunities to meet people outside their normal social circles. The temporary nature of inn communities allowed for experimental social relationships that participants could abandon without long-term consequences if they proved unsatisfactory or inappropriate. Religious and cultural differences also mixed in settings, with Christians, Jews, and Muslims sometimes sharing accommodations despite broader social tensions and legal restrictions that normally prevented such interactions. The social laboratory created by inn life influenced broader cultural development by demonstrating that class differences were often less important than individual character and competence. 49. The Great Bed of Ware Spectacle. Some inns featured enormous promotional beds like the famous Great Bed of Ware, designed to attract customers through spectacular novelty. This particular bed could sleep 15 people simultaneously and was referenced by Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, demonstrating how inns used architectural curiosities to create marketing advantages. The Great Bed wasn't just large furniture. It was a carefully engineered marketing tool designed to generate publicity, attract tourists, and create memorable experiences that guests would discuss long after their stays ended. The bed's massive size, over 12 feet wide and equally long, required custom construction techniques and specialized carpentry skills that represented significant capital investment for promotional purposes. Guests often traveled specifically to experience sleeping in the famous bed, creating early forms of novelty tourism that generated premium revenues for the White Hart Inn and Ware. The bed's fame spread through word-of-mouth marketing, literary references, and travel recommendations that made it one of medieval England's most recognizable tourist attractions. Literary figures like Shakespeare used the bed as a cultural reference point, assuming audiences would recognize allusions to this famous piece of furniture that had become part of popular culture. The bed's success inspired other inns to create their own architectural novelties and unusual features designed to attract customers through curiosity and entertainment value rather than purely practical accommodations. The promotional strategy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of marketing psychology, using spectacle and novelty to differentiate one establishment from numerous competitors offering similar basic services. The bed survived for centuries and is now preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum, making it one of the few surviving examples of medieval and furniture that can still be studied by modern researchers. The Great Bed's fame illustrates how medieval and operators used creativity and innovation to build brand recognition and customer loyalty in highly competitive hospitality markets. 50. Monastic integration and dual functions. Many medieval inns were connected to monasteries or operated by religious orders, blending commercial hospitality with spiritual duties to create unique hybrid institutions that serve both physical and spiritual needs while generating revenue to support religious activities and charitable works. These monastery inns offered services unavailable at purely commercial establishments, including religious counseling, marriage ceremonies, confession opportunities, and access to scholarly libraries that attracted educated travelers seeking intellectual as well as physical refreshment. The religious connection provided credibility and security guarantees that made nervous travelers more comfortable, knowing that religious authorities would be held accountable for guest safety and fair treatment. Monastic inns often featured superior accommodations because religious communities had access to skilled craftsmen, quality materials, and architectural expertise that created more comfortable and durable facilities than typical commercial operations. The dual mission created complex operational challenges as religious communities balanced profit motivations with spiritual obligations, sometimes leading to conflicts between commercial success and religious principles. Guest behavior expectations were typically higher at monastic inns, with religious authorities enforcing moral codes that prohibited gambling, excessive drinking, and sexual activities that were tolerated at secular establishments. The religious communities often provided charitable services, offering free accommodation to poor travelers, medical care for sick guests, and emergency assistance that reflected Christian hospitality obligations. Monastic inns frequently served as centers for pilgrimage activities, providing specialized services for religious travelers including route guidance, spiritual preparation, and connections to other religious sites. The integration created economic benefits for religious communities while providing enhanced services for travelers who valued the combination of commercial accommodation and spiritual support. Some of Europe's most successful and long-lasting inns were monastic operations that survived for centuries through careful balance of religious mission and commercial viability. 51. Sacred hospitality laws and guest rights. Ancient hospitality laws made harming a guest one of the most serious crimes imaginable, with hosts legally bound to protect guests and violating hospitality, potentially invoking divine wrath that could destroy entire communities through supernatural punishment. The hospitality obligations were considered sacred duties that transcended ordinary legal requirements, creating moral and religious frameworks that made guest protection a fundamental social responsibility. These laws created powerful protection for travelers in an era when strangers were typically viewed with suspicion and violence, establishing safe spaces where people could rest without fear of robbery, assault, or murder. The divine enforcement aspect made hospitality violations particularly terrifying because medieval people genuinely believed that God would punish entire communities for allowing guests to be harmed within their territories. Host obligations extended beyond basic safety to include providing food, shelter, and assistance that could be economically burdensome, but were considered non-negotiable moral requirements. The guest rights system created reciprocal obligations, with travelers expected to behave respectfully, pay agreed amounts, and avoid causing unnecessary trouble that would burden their hosts. Violations of hospitality laws often resulted in severe social ostracism, economic boycotts, and religious sanctions that could destroy individuals or entire communities that failed to protect guests properly. The sacred nature of hospitality created cultural attitudes that made innkeeping a semi-religious vocation with moral dimensions that extended far beyond commercial considerations. Some regions developed elaborate hospitality rituals that demonstrated commitment to guest welfare while creating ceremonial frameworks that reinforced the sacred nature of host-guest relationships. The legal protections were so strong that criminals sometimes claimed guest status to avoid punishment, creating complex legal disputes about the limits of hospitality obligations and the conditions required for legitimate guest protection. 52. Gender-specific hospitality rules. Medieval inns operated under complex gender protocols that regulated interactions between men and women through elaborate courtesy systems designed to maintain social propriety while managing the sexual tensions that inevitably arose when strangers shared intimate spaces. Men seated next to women couldn't laugh rudely, make inappropriate jokes, or engage in physical contact that could be interpreted as sexual harassment, with violations potentially leading to violence or social ostracism. The gender rules created elaborate dining choreography where seating arrangements, conversation topics, and physical movements were carefully regulated to prevent conflicts and maintain reputations. Women travelers faced particular challenges because their presence in settings was often interpreted as sexual availability, requiring protective strategies that included traveling with male companions or claiming religious status. The courtesy requirements were asymmetrical, with men bearing primary responsibility for controlling their behavior, while women were expected to manage their appearance and conduct to avoid tempting male guests. And staff served as informal chaperones, monitoring interactions between unrelated men and women while intervening when situations appeared to be developing inappropriate sexual or romantic dimensions. The gender protocols reflected broader medieval attitudes about sexuality, morality, and social control that treated women's virtue as community property, requiring collective protection and male self-restraint. Some regions developed specific traditions about gender separation in inn settings, with designated areas for women, restrictions on mixed-gender dining, and rules about overnight accommodations that varied by local custom. The rules created opportunities for romance and sexual encounters while providing plausible deniability and social protection for participants who could claim they were following proper protocols. Violations of gender protocols could result in serious social consequences, including damaged reputations, forced marriages, family conflicts, and community ostracism that affected entire social networks. 53. Universal accommodation duty. Medieval innkeepers were legally required to accept all respectable transient persons without arbitrary refusal, making them among the first businesses with anti-discrimination obligations that protected travelers from prejudice based on appearance, origin, or personal characteristics. This legal requirement was revolutionary for its time, establishing public accommodation principles that wouldn't be fully developed in modern societies until civil rights movements of the 20th century. The respectable qualification provided some discretion for innkeepers to refuse obviously dangerous or disruptive guests, but prevented discrimination against travelers based on ethnicity, religion, or social class alone. The accommodation duty created legal protections for vulnerable travelers who might otherwise face systematic exclusion from hospitality services due to prejudice or economic discrimination. Enforcement mechanisms included court actions, licensing revocations, and community boycotts that could destroy businesses that violated accommodation obligations without legitimate justification. The universal access requirement reflected practical recognition that travel infrastructure needed to serve all legitimate travelers to function effectively for commerce, communication, and social mobility. Some innkeepers attempted to circumvent accommodation duties through excessive pricing, poor service, or claims about facility limitations, leading to legal disputes that clarified the scope of hospitality obligations. The accommodation duty created tension between commercial freedom and public service obligations that influenced broader discussions about business regulation and social responsibility. Foreign travelers received particular protection under accommodation laws because their exclusion could damage international trade relationships and political alliances that benefited entire communities. The legal framework established precedents for public accommodation laws that influenced modern hospitality regulation and civil rights legislation that protects travelers from discrimination. 54. Priority bankruptcy rights. Hansa merchants in Flanders negotiated special privileges guaranteeing them priority repayment if innkeepers went bankrupt, demonstrating innkeepers' crucial role in international commerce and the sophisticated legal frameworks that protected commercial relationships across political boundaries. These bankruptcy protections reflected the enormous economic value of merchant relationships and the competitive pressures that forced operators to offer increasingly favorable terms to attract high-value commercial customers. The priority repayment agreements created legal precedents for creditor protection that influenced broader commercial law development and established frameworks for international business relationships. Hansa merchants used their collective bargaining power to negotiate favorable terms that individual travelers couldn't achieve, demonstrating the advantages of organized commercial associations in medieval business environments. The bankruptcy protections were necessary because operations were economically volatile, with success depending on unpredictable factors like weather, political stability, and seasonal travel patterns that could quickly destroy profitable businesses. The special privileges created competitive disadvantages for other travelers who received lower priority for repayment, leading to complaints about unfair treatment and demands for similar protections. Operators accepted unfavorable bankruptcy terms because Hansa merchant business was so valuable that losing these customers could be economically catastrophic for establishments dependent on commercial traffic. The legal frameworks required sophisticated understanding of international commercial law and created enforcement mechanisms that operated across political boundaries and legal systems. The priority repayment agreements influenced broader discussions about creditor rights, bankruptcy procedures, and the legal protections necessary to support international commerce in politically fragmented medieval Europe. Modern bankruptcy law still reflects principles first developed in medieval commercial relationships that recognize the need to protect essential business relationships during economic crises. 55. Political meeting restrictions. Because inns were hotbeds of political activity where political uprisings and mobs often began, local authorities closely monitored and sometimes restricted political gatherings, making innkeepers unwilling intelligence agents who had to balance customer service with political survival. The surveillance created complex situations wherein operators knew about seditious plotting but faced impossible choices between reporting their guests to authorities or risking prosecution as accomplices to treason. Political meetings in inns were attractive because these establishments provided private rooms, served alcohol that loosened tongues, and brought together people from different regions who could coordinate activities across political boundaries. The monitoring requirements turned innkeepers into informal government agents who were expected to report suspicious activities while maintaining the appearance of neutral hospitality that kept customers comfortable and unguarded. Some innkeepers became skilled at managing political tensions by providing information to authorities while protecting guests from serious consequences, creating complex relationships that served multiple political interests. The restrictions varied by political climate, with periods of stability allowing more freedom, while times of crisis bringing intensive surveillance and severe penalties for establishments that hosted seditious activities. Operators developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining plausible deniability about political activities, including providing alibis for guests, destroying evidence of meetings, and coordinating with sympathetic authorities. The political risks created additional business challenges because establishments that gained reputations as political meeting places could attract unwanted government attention while losing customers who feared association with seditious activities. Some inns specialized in serving particular political factions, creating loyal customer bases while accepting the risks that came with partisan identification in politically volatile environments. The political surveillance requirements influenced in design, with establishments incorporating architectural features that facilitated monitoring while providing discrete meeting spaces for sensitive conversations. 56. Property storage liability. Innkeepers were legally responsible for goods stored by traveling merchants, even when holding items for months, creating complex webs of commercial liability that extended far beyond simple lodging services and made operators crucial partners in international trade networks. The liability requirements were absolute. Innkeepers were responsible for stored goods regardless of circumstances, theft attempts, or natural disasters that might destroy merchant inventory held in facilities. These legal obligations made operators reluctant bankers who had to implement sophisticated security systems, insurance arrangements, and risk management strategies to protect valuable merchandise from multiple threats. The storage services were enormously profitable but financially dangerous, with successful innkeepers earning substantial fees while risking bankruptcy if major theft or disaster destroyed valuable merchant goods. Some innkeepers specialized in particular types of merchandise, developing expertise in textile storage, spice preservation, or precious metal security that made them valuable partners for merchants dealing in specific goods. The liability rules created powerful incentives for honest business practices because any hint of corruption or negligence could result in crushing financial penalties that destroyed businesses and personal wealth. Merchants used storage services strategically, leaving goods at trusted inns while traveling lighter to explore new markets or negotiate deals without carrying their entire inventory. The storage relationships created long-term business partnerships between innkeepers and merchants that often lasted decades and involved complex financial arrangements, including credit extension and investment partnerships. Some storage operations evolved into wholesale distribution businesses that bought and sold goods on their own account while providing storage services for other merchants. The liability system required sophisticated legal documentation, including detailed inventory records, insurance policies, and partnership agreements that influenced broader commercial law development. 57. Licensing by local lords. Innkeepers required licenses from local justices and lords, but the licensing system was designed more to ensure tax collection and political control than safety standards, creating regulatory frameworks that prioritized government revenue over guest protection or service quality. The licensing process involved complex negotiations where prospective innkeepers had to demonstrate political loyalty, financial capacity, and social connections that would ensure reliable tax payments and cooperative behavior toward local authorities. License fees were substantial and often included ongoing tribute payments that made ownership expensive while generating steady income for local governments that became dependent on hospitality industry revenues. The political control aspect meant that licenses could be revoked for activities that displeased authorities, giving local leaders powerful tools for managing dissent and ensuring cooperation from influential business owners. Some regions developed competitive licensing systems where multiple applicants bid for limited licenses, driving up fees while creating monopolistic conditions that benefited both governments and successful license holders. The regulatory framework provided minimal consumer protections, focusing instead on ensuring that operators could pay taxes, maintain political loyalty, and avoid activities that might threaten local stability. Corrupt licensing practices were common, with well-connected applicants receiving favorable treatment, while qualified candidates without political influence faced rejection or excessive fees. The system created barriers to entry that protected existing operators from competition while ensuring that new establishments were owned by people acceptable to local political establishments. Some innkeepers used licensing requirements strategically, building political relationships that provided protection from competitors and favorable treatment in legal disputes. The regulatory approach influenced broader business licensing practices that prioritized government control and revenue generation over market competition and consumer welfare. 58. Guild price controls. In many towns, innkeeper guilds collectively set affordable prices to maintain steady merchant traffic, creating early forms of legally sanctioned price fixing that would violate modern antitrust laws but were considered essential for economic stability in medieval commercial environments. The price coordination was explicitly designed to prevent destructive competition that could drive prices so low that an operators couldn't maintain quality standards, or so high that merchants would avoid particular towns entirely. Guild pricing decisions involve sophisticated economic analysis, including seasonal demand patterns, competitive threats from neighboring towns, and cost calculations that ensured sustainable profitability for all members. The affordable pricing strategy reflected understanding that merchant customers had alternatives and would choose travel routes based partly on accommodation costs, making price coordination essential for maintaining commercial competitiveness. Guild enforcement mechanisms included fines, membership revocation, and collective boycotts that could destroy businesses that violated agreed pricing structures or attempted to gain competitive advantages through price cutting. The price controls created stability that benefited both operators and merchant customers who could predict travel costs and plan business activities with greater certainty about accommodation expenses. Some guilds developed sophisticated pricing formulas that accounted for room quality, meal standards, service levels, and seasonal variations while maintaining coordination across all member establishments. The collective pricing power gave innkeeper guilds significant political influence because their decisions affected local commercial attractiveness and government tax revenues derived from merchant activities. Non-guild and operators faced systematic disadvantage because they couldn't match the coordinated pricing and service standards that guild members provided through collective action. The price control systems influenced broader economic regulation and created precedents for industry cooperation that balanced competition with stability in volatile medieval markets. 59. Foreigner ownership restrictions. King Edward I's 1285 statute initially allowed foreigners to own hostels, but later laws specifically barred foreigners from owning establishments along the River Thames, representing the earliest documented systematic discrimination against foreign business ownership in English commercial law. The Thames restriction reflected strategic concerns about foreign control of facilities that could be used for espionage, smuggling, or military activities that threatened English security interests along the kingdom's most important waterway. The discriminatory laws created competitive advantages for English and operators while limiting foreign investment that might have improved service quality or increased accommodation capacity in crucial commercial areas. Foreign merchants responded by forming partnerships with English citizens who could hold nominal ownership, while foreign investors provided capital and management expertise that circumvented legal restrictions. The ownership restrictions influenced broader discussions about foreign investment, national security, and economic nationalism that shaped English commercial policy for centuries. Some regions developed exemptions for particular nationalities based on political alliances or trade relationships that provided foreign merchants with limited ownership rights in specific circumstances. The enforcement mechanisms included property confiscation, business license revocation, and criminal penalties that made violation of ownership restrictions extremely dangerous for foreign investors. The Thames restriction created geographic patterns of foreign business ownership that concentrated international investment in areas where legal barriers were lower or enforcement was less strict. English and operators supported the discriminatory laws because they reduced competition while providing political cover for economic protectionism disguised as national security policy. The ownership restrictions established precedents for business regulation based on nationality that influenced immigration law, commercial policy, and international relations throughout English history. 60. Vermin paradise conditions. Medieval inns were infested with bedbugs, lice, and fleas that created living conditions so horrific that guests routinely woke covered in bites, with bedbug infestations producing characteristic pungent sweet smell described as like rotting raspberries that permeated entire buildings. The vermin problems were essentially universal because medieval understanding of pest control was primitive, and the constant flow of travelers from different regions continually reintroduced parasites that quickly spread throughout in populations. Bedbugs were particularly problematic because they could survive for months without feeding and hid in wooden furniture, wall cracks, and bedding materials that were nearly impossible to clean thoroughly with available technology. Guests developed elaborate personal protection strategies, including bringing their own bedding, wearing multiple layers of clothing to bed, and using various folk remedies that were generally ineffective against determined parasites. The vermin created additional health risks beyond mere discomfort because they could transmit diseases including typhus, plague, and various bacterial infections that spread rapidly through in populations. And operators tried various pest control methods, including burning aromatic herbs, spreading particular types of sand or ash, and maintaining cats to control rodent populations. But these efforts were largely futile. Some travelers became so desperate to avoid vermin that they paid premium prices for supposedly clean accommodations that were often just as infested as cheaper alternatives. The constant itching and discomfort from parasite bites affected traveler health, mood, and business performance, making vermin infestations significant economic problems for both operators and their customers. Wealthy travelers sometimes brought servants specifically tasked with parasite control, including personal bed inspection and treatment of bite wounds that could become seriously infected. The vermin problems were so accepted as normal that many in contracts and price negotiations included specific clauses about parasite-related accommodations and expectations. Sa siyantong komunal siyambe podkatastrupa. Multiple guests shared the same chamber pots, which were often not emptied for days, creating sanitary disasters that would violate every modern health code while spreading diseases and creating living conditions that challenge human endurance limits. The sharing arrangements meant that strangers were literally using the same toilet facilities, often without any cleaning between users, creating intimate physical contact through shared bodily waste that would horrify modern travelers. Chamber pots were frequently dumped directly into streets from upper-story windows with warning cries of Gardez-l'eau, from French, Gardez-l'eau, creating daily sewage storms that made walking near extremely hazardous. The delayed, emptying schedules meant that chamber pots often overflowed, creating additional mess in bedrooms and common areas that guests had to navigate while trying to sleep and conduct daily activities. And staff responsible for chamber pot maintenance were among the lowest paid and most socially despised employees because their work involved constant contact with human waste from dozens of strangers. The shared facilities created obvious disease transmission risks, including cholera, dysentery, and various bacterial infections that spread rapidly through in populations and into broader communities. Some wealthy guests brought personal chamber pots as luxury items, but even these had to be emptied by staff using the same disposal methods that created public health hazards. The morning emptying routines created predictable schedules that pedestrians learned to avoid, with experienced urban residents timing their movements to escape the daily sewage disposal windows. Chamber pot decorations often included crude humor, political satire, or artistic designs that transformed waste disposal into opportunities for entertainment and social commentary. The communal nature of chamber pot usage created its own etiquette systems with unwritten rules about usage priorities, cleaning responsibilities, and behavioral expectations that made intolerable situations slightly more manageable. 62. Moat sewage systems. Castle and in toilets called garderobes emptied directly into moats surrounding buildings, with Bodiam Castle featuring 28 toilets all emptying into its moat, creating fetid barriers that served as defensive features while generating horrific sanitary conditions. The defensive logic was that accumulated human waste would deter attackers, while creating physical obstacles that made siege warfare more difficult and psychologically challenging for enemy forces. The moat sewage systems required careful engineering to ensure proper flow that prevented dangerous gas buildup, while maintaining water levels that provided effective defensive barriers against military assault. The concentration of waste from dozens of people created environmental disasters that poisoned local water supplies and generated disease outbreaks that affected entire communities surrounding Castle and in complexes. Fish populations in sewage moats either died or became dangerous to eat, eliminating important food sources while creating additional health hazards for people who might consume contaminated aquatic life. The smell from sewage moats was so intense that it could be detected from considerable distances, creating distinctive atmospheric conditions that marked Kassel and in locations through olfactory rather than visual identification. Maintenance of sewage moat systems required specialized knowledge about water flow, waste decomposition, and engineering principles that made proper management expensive and technically challenging for many establishments. Some facilities attempted to manage sewage problems by diverting natural water sources through moats to create flushing action, but these efforts often simply spread contamination to broader geographic areas. The defensive effectiveness of sewage moats was questionable because experienced military forces developed techniques for dealing with waste barriers, while the health risks often affected defenders more than attackers. Modern archaeological investigations of medieval Kassel and in sites often focus on sewage systems that provide valuable insights into daily life, health conditions, and engineering capabilities of medieval builders. 63. Barber surgeon bloodletting. Medieval inns regularly hosted barber surgeons who performed bloodletting with primitive tools using leeches, lancets, and crude instruments, often spreading disease between patients rather than curing them, while creating additional health hazards for all guests. The bloodletting procedures were based on medieval medical theory that illness resulted from imbalanced bodily humors that could be corrected by removing specific quantities of blood through carefully calculated bleeding sessions. Barber surgeons traveled between inns providing medical services to guests who couldn't access urban physicians, creating mobile healthcare systems that served remote areas while spreading diseases through contaminated instruments. The surgical tools were rarely cleaned between patients, making barber surgeon visits effective disease transmission events that could infect entire populations with whatever illnesses previous patients had carried. Bloodletting procedures often weakened patients rather than healing them, creating additional health problems that required extended stays while generating revenue for both medical practitioners and accommodation providers. Some barber surgeons developed reputations for particular expertise, attracting customers who traveled specifically to receive treatment from practitioners known for success with certain conditions or surgical procedures. The medical services were expensive luxury items that primarily served wealthy travelers, creating class-based healthcare systems where poor guests suffered from untreated medical problems while rich patients received dubious but expensive treatments. And operators often received kickbacks from barber surgeons who used their establishments as regular practice locations, creating economic incentives for promoting medical services regardless of their effectiveness or safety. The dramatic nature of bloodletting procedures created entertainment for other guests who gathered to watch medical treatments that resembled theatrical performances more than modern medical care. Some patients died from barber surgeon treatments, creating legal complications about responsibility and liability that influenced early medical malpractice law development. 64. Urine diagnosis deception. Inn-based medical practitioners diagnosed illnesses by examining, smelling, and tasting guests' urine using medieval urine wheels, making treatment decisions based on flavor, color, and consistency in procedures that would horrify modern medical professionals. The urine diagnosis system was based on sophisticated medieval medical theory that connected urine characteristics to internal bodily conditions through complex analytical frameworks that practitioners studied for years to master. The tasting aspect was considered crucial because different flavors supposedly indicated specific diseases or bodily imbalances that required particular treatments, ranging from dietary changes to bloodletting procedures. Medieval urine wheels were elaborate diagnostic charts that correlated urine colors with specific medical conditions, creating systematic approaches to diagnosis that practitioners used to demonstrate their medical expertise to potential patients. The diagnostic procedures were often performed publicly, with medical practitioners explaining their findings to audiences that included other guests who could observe the analytical process and learn about medical techniques. Many practitioners were charlatans who used impressive-looking diagnostic procedures to justify expensive treatments while having minimal actual medical knowledge or healing capabilities. The urine analysis created intimate medical relationships between practitioners and patients who had to provide bodily samples for detailed examination by strangers claiming medical expertise. Some practitioners developed reputations for diagnostic accuracy, attracting patients who traveled considerable distances to receive urine analysis from experts known for successful disease identification and treatment. The medical tourism generated additional revenue for inns that hosted respected practitioners, creating economic incentives for establishments to maintain relationships with effective medical professionals. Modern medical historians study medieval urine diagnosis techniques as examples of systematic medical approaches that combined genuine observation with theoretical frameworks that were often completely wrong about human physiology. 65. Dental torture without anesthesia. Traveling barber surgeons extracted teeth at inns without any anesthesia using crude forceps, with infections from these procedures often killing patients days later, making many people prefer excruciating pain to treatment that might prove fatal. The tooth extraction procedures were brutally painful experiences that required multiple people to hold patients down, while barber surgeons used primitive tools to break teeth loose from jawbones without any pain management techniques. The instruments were often designed for multiple purposes, with the same tools used for tooth extraction, minor surgery, and various other medical procedures without cleaning or sterilization between different uses. Infections from dental procedures were extremely common because medieval understanding of bacteria and wound care was non-existent, leading to serious complications that killed many patients who survived the initial extraction trauma. The procedures were typically performed in public spaces where others and guests could observe the treatments, creating horrific entertainment that demonstrated the brutal realities of medieval medical care. Many people avoided dental treatment entirely, living with severe tooth pain rather than risking the potentially fatal complications that frequently resulted from primitive extraction procedures. Barber surgeons often combined dental work with other services, including bloodletting, minor surgery, and hair cutting, creating comprehensive personal care businesses that served multiple customer needs. The lack of pain management meant that dental patients required considerable physical restraint and emotional support from staff and other guests who assisted during painful procedures. Some practitioners developed reputations for quick, efficient extractions that minimized patient suffering, while others were known for prolonged, traumatic procedures that created lasting psychological damage. The dental services were expensive because they required specialized tools and considerable skill, making professional tooth extraction a luxury service that poor people couldn't afford despite their dental problems. 66. Maggot-infested food provisions. Medieval travel rations stored at inns included hardtack so infested with insects that soldiers were instructed to beat against the table to make the worms crawl or fall out before eating, creating dining experiences that would violate every modern food safety regulation. The insect infestations were considered normal and acceptable because medieval food preservation techniques were primitive and long-term storage inevitably resulted in insect breeding in grain-based products. Hardtack was deliberately made extremely hard to discourage insect infestations, but even the toughest biscuits eventually became breeding grounds for various insects that found ways to penetrate seemingly impenetrable food packages. The beating technique was a standard food preparation method that travelers learned as essential survival skills, with experienced people developing expertise in distinguishing edible insects from dangerous ones. Some insects were actually considered beneficial additions to travel rations because they provided additional protein and nutrients that improved the nutritional value of otherwise bland and limited food supplies. Storage facilities were designed to minimize insect problems, but the constant influx of infested supplies from various sources made pest control nearly impossible with available medieval technology. The insect problems were worse during certain seasons when breeding conditions were optimal, making summer travel particularly challenging for people dependent on stored food supplies. Wealthy travelers sometimes paid premium prices for clean food that was supposedly insect-free, though these guarantees were often meaningless because inspection techniques were inadequate for detecting insect presence. Staff developed expertise in food preparation techniques that minimized insect consumption while maximizing the nutritional value of available supplies, creating specialized knowledge that was valuable for survival. The acceptance of insect-infested food reflects broader medieval attitudes about food quality and availability that prioritize survival over palatability in environments where starvation was a constant threat. 67. Rotting meat deception practices. Unscrupulous operators attempted to serve spoiled meat disguised with heavy spices, with discovery leading to severe penalties for butchers, but the practice was common enough to require extensive regulation that influenced early food safety law development. The spice disguising technique was sophisticated, using expensive seasonings to mask the smell and taste of rotting meat while creating flavors that could fool inexperienced diners who weren't familiar with fresh meat characteristics. The penalties for serving spoiled meat were severe because authorities recognized that food poisoning could kill customers and create public health crises that affected entire communities dependent on its services. Some regions developed elaborate testing procedures, including official meat inspectors who examined in food supplies and imposed fines or business closure for establishments that violated food quality standards. The regulatory response created additional costs for operators who had to purchase higher quality meat, while implementing storage and preparation techniques that prevented spoilage in environments without refrigeration. Wealthy guests sometimes brought personal food tasters or insisted on observing food preparation to ensure they weren't being served contaminated meat that could cause serious illness or death. The spoiled meat problem was worse during warm weather when decomposition accelerated, making summer travel particularly risky for people dependent on food services that might be cutting corners to reduce costs. Some operators developed reputations for food quality that commanded premium prices from customers willing to pay extra for assurance that their meals were safe and fresh. The spice trade was partly driven by demand for products that could preserve meat and disguise spoilage, creating economic incentives for international commerce that brought exotic seasonings to European markets. Modern food safety regulations still reflect principles first developed in medieval responses to food quality problems that recognize the need for government oversight of commercial food preparation. 68. Contaminated water systems. Water supplies were frequently contaminated by groundwater pollution from nearby cesspits, with many located near streams that were actually open sewers, like London's Shitbrook, creating public health disasters that spread diseases throughout populations. The water contamination was often invisible and tasteless, making it impossible for guests to detect dangerous pollution that could cause serious illness or death within days of consumption. Well water was particularly dangerous because underground water sources frequently connected with cesspit drainage, creating contamination that spread far beyond the immediate vicinity of waste disposal sites. Operators often knew about water quality problems, but had limited alternatives because clean water sources were scarce in urban areas where sewage and industrial waste had polluted most available supplies. The contamination problems were worse during dry periods when water levels dropped and pollution became more concentrated, making certain seasons particularly dangerous for travelers dependent on water supplies. Some establishments attempted to improve water quality through filtering techniques using sand, cloth, or other materials, but these methods were generally ineffective against bacterial contamination that caused most waterborne diseases. Wealthy guests sometimes paid extra for water brought from distant sources that were supposedly clean, though transportation and storage often introduced additional contamination that negated any quality advantages. The water problems influenced drinking preferences that favored ale and wine over water, creating cultural attitudes about beverage consumption that persisted long after water quality improvements made plain water safer to drink. Locations were often chosen based on apparent water quality, But medieval understanding of contamination was inadequate for identifying safe sources or predicting pollution problems that developed over time. Public health authorities eventually recognized connections between water quality and disease outbreaks, leading to regulations that required operators to provide safe drinking water or face business closure. 69. Lice as religious martyrdom. Medieval religious figures actually embraced lice infestations as forms of asceticism, with Thomas Cantilupe's servants reporting finding whole handfuls of lice in his bedding, while some religious figures deliberately replaced lice on their bodies rather than removing them. The religious logic held that physical discomfort from parasites was spiritually beneficial because it created opportunities for suffering that brought believers closer to Christ's passion and demonstrated rejection of worldly comfort. Some religious orders specifically prohibited lice removal, treating parasite infestations as tests of faith and spiritual discipline that separated truly devout believers from those who prioritized physical comfort over spiritual development. The practice created health hazards that extended beyond individual religious practitioners because lice infestations spread rapidly through close contact, affecting entire religious communities and their visitors. And guests who were housed near religious travelers sometimes found themselves dealing with lice infestations that spread from people who deliberately maintained parasite colonies as spiritual practices. The religious embrace of lice created cultural attitudes that normalized parasite infestations and discouraged effective pest control measures that could have reduced disease transmission and improved public health. Some religious leaders developed reputations for extreme lice infestations that became signs of particular holiness, attracting followers who wanted to demonstrate similar spiritual dedication through deliberate parasite cultivation. The practice influenced broader medieval attitudes about cleanliness, health, and spirituality that treated bodily comfort as potentially sinful indulgence that distracted from proper religious focus. Medical authorities sometimes conflicted with religious leaders about lice management, creating tensions between health recommendations and spiritual practices that prioritized suffering over physical well-being. The religious lice tolerance created additional challenges for operators who had to balance customer comfort with respect for religious practices that deliberately maintained parasite infestations in shared facilities. 70. Ammonia delousing strategy. Medieval toilets stank so powerfully of ammonia that people deliberately hung clothing near latrines because the fumes killed mites and other parasites, making this a legitimate cleaning method despite the horrific smell that would nauseate modern visitors. The ammonia concentration from concentrated human urine created chemical environments that were genuinely effective at killing various insects and parasites that plagued medieval clothing and personal belongings. The delousing technique required careful timing because extended exposure to ammonia fumes could damage fabrics, while insufficient exposure failed to kill parasites, creating optimization challenges that experienced travelers learned through trial and error. And staff often provided clothing hanging services near toilet facilities, creating specialized businesses that combined waste disposal with parasite control and integrated systems that addressed multiple customer needs. The chemical effectiveness of ammonia delousing was discovered through practical observation rather than scientific understanding, demonstrating how medieval people developed useful techniques without comprehending the underlying principles that made them work. Some wealthy travelers paid premium prices for extended ammonia exposure that ensured thorough parasite elimination, creating luxury services based on proximity to human waste that would seem bizarre to modern consumers. The technique was particularly effective against certain types of parasites including lice, fleas, and mites that were common problems for travelers who couldn't maintain personal hygiene standards during long journeys. Toilet design sometimes included specific features for clothing hanging that maximized ammonia exposure while preventing damage from moisture or excessive chemical concentration that could destroy valuable garments. The practice created additional revenue opportunities for operators who could charge extra for specialized delousing services that combine sanitation needs with pest control in efficient integrated systems. Modern chemical pest control still uses ammonia-based products that reflect principles first discovered through medieval toilet-based clothing treatment techniques that prioritized effectiveness over comfort. 71. Criminal pilgrimage sentences. Many medieval guests were actually criminals sentenced to pilgrimage as punishment instead of prison time, with courts ordering convicts to walk to Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, creating constant flows of dangerous individuals through systems. The pilgrimage sentencing system was based on religious beliefs that spiritual journeys could provide redemption for criminal behavior while removing dangerous people from local communities for extended periods. Criminal pilgrims often carried official documentation that identified them as court-ordered travelers, creating complex situations wherein operators had to serve potentially dangerous guests while maintaining safety for other customers. The sentences typically required proof of completion through official seals or witness statement from destination religious authorities, creating early forms of supervised probation that monitored criminal compliance with court orders. Some criminal pilgrims used their forced travels as opportunities for additional crimes, robbing fellow travelers or committing new offenses in communities along their required routes. Operators developed techniques for identifying criminal pilgrims and implementing security measures that protected other guests while complying with legal obligations to serve court-ordered travelers. The mixing of criminal and legitimate pilgrims created social dynamics that influenced religious practices, with criminal travelers sometimes experiencing genuine spiritual transformation, while others simply completed minimum requirements to satisfy legal obligations. Some criminal pilgrims never returned to their home communities, using court-ordered travel as opportunities to escape to new regions where their criminal histories were unknown and they could start fresh lives. The system created international criminal mobility that spread certain types of crime across European boundaries, while providing alternatives to execution or imprisonment that were expensive for medieval justice systems. Records sometimes documented criminal pilgrims who became repeat customers, returning to favorite establishments during subsequent voluntary pilgrimages or additional court-ordered journeys for new offenses. 72. Disease transmission highways. Medieval inns served as disease transmission centers along pilgrimage routes, with the Black Death spreading rapidly through in networks as infected travelers shared beds, chamber pots, and dining spaces with healthy people from across Europe. The concentrated mixing of people from different regions created perfect conditions for disease transmission because pathogens could jump between populations that had no previous exposure and therefore no immunity to new infections. Pilgrimage routes became disease highways that carried epidemics across vast distances faster than they could spread through normal population contact, creating pandemic conditions that affected entire continents. The Black Death's rapid spread through Europe was facilitated by networks that brought together infected and healthy travelers in intimate contact that guaranteed disease transmission through multiple pathways, including respiratory, contact, and contaminated material exposure. Operators often had no warning about disease outbreaks because symptoms might not appear for days after infection, meaning that seemingly healthy guests could be spreading deadly diseases throughout their stays. The economic impacts were devastating because disease outbreaks could kill large percentages of staff and customers while creating reputation damage that drove away potential guests who feared infection. Some inns developed early quarantine procedures that isolated sick guests, but these measures were often inadequate because diseases could spread before symptoms appeared and isolation facilities were primitive. The religious aspects of pilgrimage travel complicated disease response because many people believed that faith would protect them from illness, leading to continued travel and in usage during epidemic conditions. Medical knowledge about disease transmission was inadequate for effective prevention, with most people unaware that diseases spread through contact, contaminated materials, or respiratory transmission that made environments particularly dangerous. Modern epidemiology studies use medieval records to understand how diseases spread through European populations and how travel networks influenced pandemic development patterns that affected historical demographics. 73. Massive pilgrim infrastructure. At its medieval peak, Santiago de Compostela received an estimated 250,000 pilgrims annually, all requiring accommodation that created massive infrastructure demands with specialized pilgrim hospitals built every 15 to 20 miles along major routes. The infrastructure development represented enormous capital investment that required coordination between religious authorities, government officials, and private investors who recognized the economic opportunities created by mass religious tourism. Pilgrim hospitals were specialized facilities that provided basic accommodation, medical care, and spiritual services specifically designed for religious travelers who often arrived in poor health after weeks or months of difficult travel. The spacing calculations were based on daily walking distances that accounted for terrain difficulty, weather conditions, and the physical limitations of travelers who were often elderly, sick, or traveling in large groups that moved slowly. Some pilgrimage routes became so crowded during peak seasons that accommodation shortages forced travelers to sleep outdoors, creating public health problems and increased mortality rates among religious pilgrims. The economic impact on communities along pilgrimage routes was enormous, with entire regions developing economies based on serving religious travelers who needed food, accommodation, equipment repair, and medical services. Competition between different routes created infrastructure arms races as communities invested in superior facilities to attract pilgrim traffic that generated substantial local revenue through accommodation, food, and service spending. The pilgrim infrastructure influenced broader transportation development because roads, bridges, and accommodation facilities built for religious travelers also served commercial and political purposes that benefited entire regions. Some pilgrim hospitals evolved into permanent medical facilities that served local populations, creating healthcare infrastructure that outlasted the religious tourism that originally justified their construction. Modern tourism infrastructure in many European regions still follows patterns established by medieval pilgrimage routes that created transportation networks and accommodation clusters that remain economically important today. 74. Servant bed arrangements. Lower-class travelers and servants slept communally in great halls on straw-covered floors, sharing space with animals, and were cleared out and the area washed down, each morning like livestock, creating living conditions that treated humans as barely superior to barnyard animals. The straw bedding was often infested with insects, contaminated with animal waste, and rarely changed, creating unsanitary conditions that spread diseases while providing minimal comfort for exhausted travelers. The animal sharing meant that servants slept alongside horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens that created noise, smells, and sanitation problems that made rest difficult and health hazards constant. The morning cleaning routine involved literally sweeping human occupants out of great halls so staff could remove waste, replace straw, and prepare spaces for daily activities, treating people as temporary occupants rather than paying customers. Servants traveling with wealthy masters often received slightly better treatment, but still faced systematic discrimination that relegated them to the worst accommodations regardless of their personal wealth or social importance. The communal sleeping arrangements created opportunities for theft, assault, and sexual violence because there was no privacy or security for vulnerable travelers who couldn't afford private accommodations. Some servants developed strategies for improving their situations, including forming protective groups, bribing in staff for better treatment, or saving money to occasionally purchase upgrades to slightly better accommodations. The class segregation was so rigid that servants were often prohibited from entering areas reserved for their social superiors, creating complex navigation requirements for people trying to serve masters while remaining in their designated inferior spaces. The dehumanizing treatment reflected broader medieval attitudes about social hierarchy that viewed lower-class people as inherently less deserving of comfort, safety, and basic human dignity. Modern labor rights and accommodation standards developed partly in response to historical treatment of working-class travelers who faced systematic discrimination and dangerous conditions in commercial hospitality establishments. Sotifem in hierarchy brutality. Wealthy guests could literally throw poorer travelers out of beds they wanted, with social rank determining not just bed quality, but access to food, medical care, and basic sanitation facilities and systems that prioritized wealth over humanity. The hierarchy enforcement was often violent, with wealthy travelers using physical force or threatening armed servants to displace lower-class guests who had paid for accommodations but lacked social protection against elite aggression. And staff typically supported wealthy guests in hierarchy disputes because their tips and future business were more valuable than protecting poor customers who couldn't afford to demand better treatment or take their business elsewhere. The bed displacement practices created complex social dynamics, where middle-class travelers had to constantly assess their relative status compared to other guests and be prepared to defer to their social superiors regardless of prior arrangements. Food service followed strict hierarchy protocols, with wealthy guests receiving first choice of available meals, while poor travelers received whatever remained, often meaning no food at all when supplies were limited. Medical care during emergencies was rationed by social class, with wealthy patients receiving immediate attention, while poor guests might be ignored even during life-threatening situations that required urgent intervention. Sanitation facilities were segregated by class, with wealthy guests gaining access to better toilets, washing facilities, and clean water, while poor travelers used inferior facilities that were often unsanitary and dangerous. The hierarchy system created opportunities for social climbing through strategic relationships, bribery, or deception that allowed clever travelers to gain access to better treatment by manipulating social perceptions. Some operators developed reputations for fair treatment regardless of social class, attracting customers who valued predictable service standards over the arbitrary hierarchy enforcement that characterized most establishments. The brutal hierarchy enforcement reflected broader, medieval social structures that treated class differences as natural and justified extreme inequality in treatment that would violate modern human rights standards. 76. Shared eating utensil contamination. Most medieval inn diners ate with bare hand from communal dishes since forks were extremely rare, with etiquette guides prohibiting returning food to plates after touching, while requiring avoidance of touching ears or noses during meals. The contamination risks were enormous because dozens of people touched the same food with unwashed hands that had been used for various unsanitary purposes, including personal hygiene, animal handling, and waste management. Disease transmission through shared food was common and often deadly, with cholera, dysentery, and various bacterial infections spreading rapidly through dining groups that had no understanding of germ theory or food safety principles. The etiquette rules were attempts to minimize contamination risks through behavioral modification, but were largely ineffective because medieval hygiene standards were inadequate for preventing disease transmission through shared eating arrangements. Communal eating created intimate social bonding experiences that brought strangers together through shared food, but also created vulnerability to diseases that could kill entire populations within days of initial infection. Some wealthy travelers brought personal eating utensils and insisted on separate food service. But even these precautions were often ineffective because food preparation involved communal contact that introduced contamination before individual service. The hand-eating techniques required considerable skill to consume various types of food efficiently while maintaining social propriety and avoiding behaviors that offended other diners sharing the same meal. Bread served dual purposes as food and eating utensil, with thick slices used as plates and smaller pieces used to scoop up liquids and small food particles in systems that maximize food utility while minimizing waste. The shared eating experience created opportunities for social networking, business discussions, and romantic encounters that would have been impossible with modern individual dining arrangements that prioritize hygiene over social interaction. Operators carefully managed communal dining to maximize capacity while minimizing conflicts that could arise from intimate eating arrangements between strangers with different cultural backgrounds and social expectations. 77. Gender-mixed sleeping horror. There were rarely separate rooms for women, with female travelers usually sharing beds with their husbands, even if it meant displacing male strangers, while women without husbands might be forced to share beds with male strangers in arrangements that created obvious risks. The gender mixing reflected practical accommodation limitations rather than intentional social policy, but created dangerous situations where women faced sexual assault risks from male bedmates who were complete strangers with no social accountability. Married women traveling with husbands could demand bed-sharing rights that displaced other male travelers, creating complex negotiations about sleeping arrangements that balanced gender propriety with social hierarchy and payment obligations. Single women faced impossible choices between sharing beds with strange men or sleeping in common areas where they were even more vulnerable to assault, theft, and other forms of victimization. The lack of privacy meant that intimate marital activities occurred in shared bedrooms with other occupants, creating awkward situations that violated modern concepts of personal privacy and sexual boundaries. Some women traveled disguised as men to avoid gender-based sleeping arrangement problems, but discovery of deception could result in serious legal and social consequences, including accusations of fraud or sexual impropriety. And operators developed informal protection systems for vulnerable women, including strategic bed assignments, staff monitoring, and intervention protocols that provided minimal safety improvements in inherently dangerous environments. Wealthy women sometimes paid premium prices for private rooms or brought large entourages that could provide protection, but these options were available only to a small minority of female travelers. The gender mixing created opportunities for romantic relationships and sexual encounters that sometimes led to marriages, but more often resulted in exploitation of women who had limited legal protection against male aggression. Religious women claimed special protections based on their spiritual status, but even nuns and other religious figures faced risks in mixed-gender sleeping arrangements that challenged their vows and safety. 78. Priority accommodation systems. Inns operated complex priority systems where social rank, payment ability, and political connections determined not just bed quality, but access to food, warmth, and safety, with lower-paying guests routinely ejected for nobility in systems that treated hospitality as privilege rather than service. The priority enforcement created constant anxiety for travelers who never knew whether their accommodations would be honored if higher-status guests arrived, demanding the same spaces they had reserved and paid for in advance. Political connections were often more important than payment ability because nobles could provide protection, business opportunities, or legal immunity that made their satisfaction more valuable than immediate revenue from ordinary customers. The ejection process was often humiliating and dangerous, with displaced guests forced to find alternative accommodations at night in unfamiliar areas where they faced robbery, assault, or death from exposure to weather. Some inn operators developed sophisticated overbooking strategies that maximized revenue by accepting reservations from multiple guests for the same accommodations, while gambling that some wouldn't arrive or could be displaced without serious consequences. The priority system created opportunities for corruption wherein staff accepted bribes to guarantee accommodation security or provide advance warning about potential displacement from higher priority guests. Lower-class travelers developed defensive strategies, including forming groups for mutual protection, paying premium prices for displacement insurance, or cultivating relationships within staff who could provide early warning about priority conflicts. The accommodation hierarchy reflected broader social power structures that treated elite comfort as more important than common welfare, creating hospitality systems that reinforced rather than challenged social inequality. Some regions developed legal protections for confirmed reservations, but enforcement was difficult when conflicts involved powerful nobles who could retaliate against inn operators or government officials who challenged their accommodation demands. The priority system influenced modern hospitality industry practices, including overbooking policies, upgrade procedures, and customer loyalty programs that continue to prioritize certain guests over others based on economic and social factors. 79. Silk Road sexual commerce. Medieval Silk Road merchants commonly lodged in townspeople's houses, sleeping with their daughters, and leaving expensive gifts like Persian rugs in return, with host families publicly announcing, "We got this out of the deal," in cultural practices that commercialize sexuality as hospitality amenity. The sexual commerce was considered normal business practice rather than prostitution because it occurred within hospitality frameworks that provided social legitimacy and family approval for arrangements that would be considered criminal in modern contexts. The expensive gifts served as both payment and social markers that demonstrated the family's success in attracting wealthy merchant visitors while providing compensation that could support households for months or years. Host families competed to attract the wealthiest merchants by offering the most attractive daughters, creating markets for sexual access that influenced family economic strategies and marriage arrangements throughout Silk Road communities. The public announcements about gifts received served as advertising for future merchant visitors while establishing social status based on the value of compensation received for sexual hospitality services. Daughters and merchant hosting families had little choice about sexual participation because family economic survival often depended on income generated through hospitality services that included sexual access as standard amenities. The cultural legitimacy of sexual commerce created complex social dynamics where families balanced traditional moral values with economic opportunities that required compromising sexual autonomy for financial benefit. Merchant travelers expected sexual access as part of standard hospitality packages, with accommodation decisions often based on the availability and attractiveness of female family members rather than purely commercial considerations. The practice influenced broader cultural attitudes about sexuality, hospitality, and economic relationships that normalized sexual commerce within family structures that provided social protection and economic legitimacy. Modern tourism in some Silk Road regions still reflects historical patterns of sexual commerce that created cultural expectations about tourist local relationships that continue to influence contemporary hospitality practices. 80. Scandinavian divine hospitality obligations. Nordic societies had near-religious hospitality obligations far more stringent than elsewhere in Europe, with Tacitus noting, "It is accounted a sin to turn any man away from your door, while violation could provoke wrath of the gods that threatened entire communities." The divine enforcement created powerful supernatural incentives for generous hospitality because Nordic peoples genuinely believed that mistreating guests could result in divine punishment affecting entire families, villages, or regions through natural disasters, military defeats, or economic catastrophes. The hospitality obligations were absolute rather than conditional, requiring hosts to provide accommodation, food, and protection to any traveler regardless of their social status, apparent wealth, or personal characteristics that might make them undesirable guests. The religious framework created cultural expectations that made refusing hospitality virtually impossible because community members would view violations as threats to collective welfare that justified intervention to protect everyone from divine retribution. Nordic hospitality included elaborate ritual elements that demonstrated proper respect for guests while invoking divine protection for both hosts and travelers through ceremonial procedures that sanctified the host-guest relationship. The divine hospitality created economic burdens for households that might be required to provide expensive hospitality services to demanding guests while having no recourse for excessive costs or unreasonable demands. Some travelers exploited Nordic hospitality obligations by making excessive demands or extending stays beyond reasonable limits, while claiming divine protection against hosts who might want to limit their generosity. The religious enforcement created cultural traditions that emphasized honor, generosity, and social responsibility as fundamental values that define Nordic identity and distinguish their societies from neighboring cultures with less stringent hospitality obligations. The divine hospitality influenced Nordic legal systems that incorporated supernatural enforcement mechanisms alongside secular penalties for various social violations that threatened community welfare through divine displeasure. Modern Scandinavian social welfare systems reflect historical cultural values about collective responsibility and generous treatment of strangers that originated in divine hospitality obligations that prioritize community welfare over individual interests. 81. Byzantine brothel inns. Archaeological evidence from Bet Shean reveals Byzantine inns incorporated brothels as standard amenities, featuring semicircular exedras with multiple private rooms, some with upper stories architecturally planned for prostitution services that were integrated into legitimate accommodation businesses. The architectural integration demonstrated that sexual services were considered normal in amenities rather than illegal activities, with specialized spaces designed specifically for prostitution alongside traditional accommodation facilities. The semicircular exedra design provided discrete access to prostitution facilities while maintaining visual separation from main areas that serve customers seeking only traditional accommodation and meal services. The upper story arrangements created hierarchical prostitution services with different quality levels and pricing structures that reflected customer social status and payment ability in systems that matched sexual services to economic capabilities. The archaeological evidence includes specialized furnishings, decorative elements, and architectural features that were specifically designed for prostitution activities, demonstrating sophisticated planning and substantial investment in sexual service facilities. Byzantine inn brothels operated under legal frameworks that regulated sexual commerce while generating tax revenue for government authorities who benefited financially from integrated prostitution services that served travelers and local customers. The integration created economic advantages for operators who could offer comprehensive services while generating revenue from accommodation, food, alcohol, and sexual entertainment that maximize profits from each customer visit. Religious authorities apparently tolerated or even supported in-brothel operations because they provided controlled sexual outlets that were considered preferable to unregulated prostitution that might occur without official supervision. The architectural sophistication demonstrates that Byzantine sexual commerce was economically important and socially accepted enough to justify substantial capital investment in permanent facilities designed specifically for integrated hospitality and prostitution services. Modern archaeological investigations continue to discover Byzantine inn brothel sites that provide insights into historical attitudes about sexuality, commerce, and social regulation that influenced medieval European hospitality development. 82. Spanish Mudéjar influence. Spanish medieval inns incorporated Islamic architectural elements including horseshoe arches, geometric patterns, and advanced engineering, creating unique hybrid styles unknown elsewhere in Europe that reflected the sophisticated Islamic influence on Iberian Peninsula design and construction techniques. The architectural fusion resulted from Christian reconquest of Muslim territories, where existing Islamic buildings were converted to in use, while new construction incorporated Islamic design elements that were superior to contemporary Christian architectural techniques. The horseshoe arch design was not merely decorative but provided superior structural support that allowed for larger interior spaces and more sophisticated room arrangements that improved in functionality and customer comfort. Islamic geometric patterns were incorporated into decorative schemes that demonstrated cultural sophistication while reflecting mathematical principles that influenced broader European artistic development through cultural exchange and in settings. The advanced engineering included sophisticated heating systems, water management techniques, and ventilation designs that made Spanish inns more comfortable and sanitary than typical European establishments that lacked Islamic technological innovations. Christian inn operators maintained Islamic architectural features because they provided practical advantages, including superior climate control, structural stability, and aesthetic appeal that attracted customers willing to pay premium prices for enhanced comfort. The cultural fusion created unique hospitality environments that combined Christian religious sensibilities with Islamic architectural sophistication, producing hybrid cultural spaces that reflected broader social integration in reconquered territories. Some Spanish inns maintained Islamic decorative programs, including calligraphy and geometric designs that created multicultural aesthetic environments unusual elsewhere in medieval Europe, where cultural integration was less common. The architectural influence spread beyond Spain as travelers experienced superior Spanish in design and demanded similar features in establishments throughout Europe, creating technological transfer that influenced broader European architectural development. Modern Spanish in design still reflects medieval Islamic influence through architectural elements that demonstrate the lasting impact of cultural fusion that created distinctive regional hospitality traditions. 83. French regulated prostitution districts. Medieval French authorities established designated districts for prostitution within complexes, with Louis IX designating 9 specific Paris streets where sexual services were legally permitted, requiring inns to light red lanterns when sexual services were available to customers. The regulation system created legal frameworks that protected both prostitutes and customers while generating tax revenue for government authorities who benefited financially from organized sexual commerce that operated under official supervision. The Red Lantern requirement created visual advertising systems that allowed customers to identify establishments offering sexual services while providing discreet signaling that didn't offend people seeking only traditional accommodation amenities. The designated districts concentrated sexual commerce in specific geographic areas that could be more easily monitored, regulated, and taxed while protecting residential neighborhoods from activities that many residents found objectionable. Operators in regulated districts were required to meet specific standards for prostitute health, facility cleanliness, and customer safety that created quality controls unavailable in unregulated sexual commerce that operated without government oversight. The licensing systems required prostitutes to register with authorities and submit to regular health inspections that were intended to prevent disease transmission, while creating official records that could be used for taxation and law enforcement. The regulation created hierarchical prostitution systems with different quality levels and pricing structures that reflected customer social status, while ensuring that sexual services were available to travelers with varying economic capabilities. Religious authorities negotiated complex accommodations with secular governments that allowed regulated prostitution while maintaining moral positions that officially disapproved of sexual commerce outside marriage. The French regulatory model influenced prostitution policy throughout Europe as other regions adopted similar licensing, taxation, and zoning approaches that balanced moral concerns with practical recognition of sexual commerce demand. Modern prostitution regulation still reflects medieval precedents that attempted to balance moral concerns with practical necessity while generating government revenue from activities that couldn't be eliminated through prohibition alone. 84. Germanic compensation hospitality systems. Germanic legal traditions emphasize compensation-based hospitality systems where innkeepers who violated hospitality duties faced specific financial penalties rather than religious sanctions found in other regions, creating secular enforcement mechanisms that prioritized economic remedies over spiritual consequences. The compensation systems established precise payment schedules for different types of hospitality violations, including inadequate food service, unsafe accommodations, theft of guest property, and failure to provide adequate protection from criminal activity. The financial penalties were calculated based on guest social status, economic losses incurred, and the severity of hospitality violations and systems that attempted to provide proportional justice through monetary compensation rather than physical punishment. Germanic legal codes included detailed specifications about hospitality obligations, including minimum food quality standards, accommodation requirements, and security measures that innkeepers were legally required to provide to avoid financial liability. The secular enforcement created predictable legal environments where both innkeepers and guests understood their rights and obligations, while having access to formal dispute resolution procedures that didn't depend on religious authority. The compensation approach reflected Germanic cultural values that emphasized practical problem-solving and economic relationships over spiritual considerations that dominated hospitality law in other European regions. Some Germanic regions developed sophisticated insurance systems where innkeepers paid premiums to collective funds that could compensate guests for losses incurred due to inadequate hospitality services or criminal activity. The legal frameworks created competitive advantages for regions that offered predictable hospitality standards because merchants could conduct business with greater confidence about their legal protections and remedies for service failures. The compensation systems influenced broader Germanic legal development by establishing principles about commercial liability, contract enforcement, and customer protection that extended beyond hospitality industry regulation. Modern hospitality liability law reflects Germanic precedents that emphasize financial compensation rather than criminal punishment for service failures that caused economic losses or personal injuries to paying customers. 85. Italian city-state variations. Italian medieval inns varied dramatically between city-states, with Venice, Florence, and Genoa each having distinct customs, specialized accommodations for specific trades or nationalities, and political fragmentation creating different hospitality laws within small geographical areas. Venetian inns specialized in serving international merchants involved in Eastern trade, featuring sophisticated currency exchange services, interpreters fluent in multiple languages, and cultural accommodations that made foreign traders comfortable in unfamiliar environments. Florentine establishments focused on banking and financial services, providing secure storage for valuable documents, access to credit and lending services, and business meeting facilities that supported the city's role as a major financial center. Genoese inns served maritime commerce with specialized services for ship crews, cargo storage facilities, and connections to shipping companies that could provide transportation for passengers and freight throughout the Mediterranean. The political fragmentation meant that hospitality laws, taxation systems, and regulatory requirements could change dramatically within distances of only a few miles as travelers moved between different city-state jurisdictions. Some inns developed expertise in serving particular nationalities, including Germans, French, or English travelers who had specific cultural requirements, dietary restrictions, and business needs that required specialized knowledge and services. The competitive environment created innovation pressures that drove Italian inns to develop superior services, architectural features, and customer amenities that influenced hospitality standards throughout Europe. Trade specialization meant that different inns catered to silk merchants, spice traders, bankers, or artisans with industry-specific services that reflected the economic diversity of Italian commercial centers. The cultural sophistication of Italian inns included artistic decoration, musical entertainment, and intellectual activities that attracted travelers seeking cultural enrichment alongside commercial accommodation services. Modern Italian hospitality continues to reflect medieval regional variations that created distinctive local traditions and service approaches that distinguish different areas within the country's diverse hospitality landscape. 86. Eastern European feudal restrictions. Eastern European feudal systems severely restricted commoner travel, making innkeeping economically unviable in many regions while creating stark contrasts with Western European and networks and forcing greater reliance on private household accommodation arrangements. The travel restrictions were designed to maintain feudal labor systems by preventing peasants from leaving their assigned territories, creating legal barriers that limited the customer base for commercial accommodation establishments. Aristocratic control over travel permissions meant that most inn customers were nobles or their authorized representatives, creating limited markets that couldn't support extensive inn networks comparable to those in Western Europe. The economic unviability forced many regions to rely on monasteries, noble households, and informal hospitality arrangements that provided accommodation through personal relationships rather than commercial transactions. Some areas developed specialized inns that served only particular social classes or occupations, creating exclusive establishments that reflected the rigid social hierarchies that characterized Eastern European feudal societies. The restricted travel created isolated regional economies, with limited commercial exchange that reduced demand for the accommodation services that supported extensive networks in more commercially developed areas. Political instability and warfare made an investment risky, because establishments could be destroyed or confiscated during conflicts that were more frequent and devastating in politically fragmented Eastern European regions. The household accommodation system created informal networks based on family connections, political alliances, and social obligations that provided lodging through personal relationships rather than commercial arrangements. Some Eastern European regions developed seasonal accommodation patterns wherein inns operated only during specific periods when travel restrictions were relaxed or particular types of commerce were permitted. The contrast between Eastern and Western European accommodation systems influenced broader cultural and economic development patterns that affected social mobility, commercial development, and political integration across the continent. 87. English legal peculiarities. English innkeepers were among the wealthiest, most influential society members, participating in local government and acting as banking agents, while provincial capitals around 1400 had 10 to 20 inns each, demonstrating the industry's massive scale and economic importance. The wealth accumulation was extraordinary because English inn operators combined accommodation revenue with banking services, political influence, and commercial partnerships that created multiple income streams and investment opportunities. Political participation included serving as local magistrates, tax collectors, and government representatives who used their inn-based social networks to influence policy decisions and maintain political connections that protected their business interests. The banking functions made innkeepers crucial figures in local economies who provided credit, currency exchange, and financial services that supported commercial development throughout their regions. The concentration of 10 to 20 inns in provincial capitals represented enormous capital investment that employed hundreds of workers while serving thousands of customers who generated substantial economic activity. English innkeepers often owned multiple properties, including agricultural land, urban real estate, and commercial buildings that diversified their investment portfolios while providing additional income sources beyond accommodation services. The social influence extended to marriage arrangements, business partnerships, and political alliances that made successful innkeepers among the most connected and powerful individuals in their communities. Some English innkeepers accumulated wealth comparable to minor nobility while maintaining social positions that allowed them to interact with all social classes in ways that aristocrats couldn't achieve. The economic scale created employment opportunities for hundreds of thousands of people, including construction workers, craftsmen, food suppliers, and service providers who depended on the industry for their livelihoods. The English inn industry's success influenced economic development policies and commercial regulation that recognized hospitality services as crucial infrastructure requiring government support and protection. 88. Medieval and poisoning attempts. Persistent rumors of innkeeper-assisted poisoning led to elaborate precautions, including hosts taking first bites, testing with unicorn horns, narwhal tusks, and using specialized poison-detecting vessels made from exotic materials that supposedly change color when exposed to toxins. The poisoning fears were justified because political assassination through food was common, with documented cases of rulers, nobles, and wealthy merchants being murdered through carefully planned poisoning schemes that often involved staff as accomplices. Unicorn horn testing was based on medieval beliefs that these magical objects could detect poison through color changes or other supernatural signs, leading to substantial markets for narwhal tusks sold as unicorn horns to paranoid travelers. The specialized vessels included cups made from rhinoceros horn, bezoar stones, and other exotic materials that were believed to neutralize poisons or provide warning about contaminated food and drink. Some travelers employed personal food tasters or insisted on preparing their own meals to avoid potential poisoning, creating complex accommodation arrangements that required special facilities and security measures. The poisoning concerns influenced in design with features including secure kitchens, private dining areas, and controlled access to food preparation spaces that could prevent tampering by hostile staff or other guests. Wealthy guests sometimes brought their own cookware, ingredients, and even personal chefs to ensure complete control over food preparation that eliminated opportunities for poisoning by hostile operators. The paranoia created business opportunities for merchants selling poison detection devices, antidotes, and protective amulets that promised to protect travelers from assassination attempts through contaminated food. Some poisoning attempts were successful, creating scandals that destroyed reputations while generating widespread fear about food safety that influenced customer behavior and industry practices throughout medieval Europe. The detection methods were generally ineffective because medieval understanding of chemistry was inadequate for reliable poison identification, meaning that elaborate precautions often provided false security while missing real dangers. 89. An investment by religious institutions. Monasteries and university colleges were major investors in construction and operation, creating complex relationships between religious institutions, officially promoting chastity and hospitality businesses, often including sexual services as standard amenities. The investment decisions reflected practical recognition that generated reliable income that could fund religious activities while providing essential community services that aligned with Christian hospitality obligations. The moral contradictions created theological debates about whether religious institutions could profit from businesses that facilitated activities including gambling, drinking, and sexual commerce that violated official church teachings. Some religious investors attempted to impose moral restrictions on operations, prohibiting gambling, limiting alcohol sales, and forbidding prostitution while accepting lower profits in exchange for ethical consistency. The economic relationships were often disguised through complex legal arrangements that created layers of separation between religious institutions and potentially immoral business activities while maintaining investment benefits. University college investments were particularly common because these institutions needed reliable income to fund educational activities, while their scholars could provide expertise in business management and legal compliance. The religious investment created competitive advantages for operators who gained access to capital, political protection, and social credibility that secular competitors couldn't match through purely commercial relationships. Some monasteries developed specialized hospitality ministries that combined commercial operations with charitable services for poor travelers who couldn't afford standard accommodation fees. The theological justifications emphasized Christian hospitality obligations and community service benefits, while minimizing attention to potentially immoral activities that generated the profits that funded religious activities. Modern church investment policies still reflect medieval precedents that balance moral considerations with practical financial needs while attempting to avoid direct involvement in activities that contradict religious teachings. 90. Women's accommodation discrimination. Systematic exclusion of women from taverns unless accompanied by husbands was legally enforced across much of Europe, while women could use public power to impose limits on male drinking behavior when it interfered with household duties and family welfare. The legal exclusions were justified through arguments about moral protection that claimed unaccompanied women in taverns would face sexual assault risks while potentially engaging in prostitution or other immoral activities. The enforcement mechanisms included fines for establishments that served unaccompanied women, legal penalties for women who violated exclusion rules, and social sanctions that could destroy reputations and family relationships. The public power provisions allowed women to petition authorities for intervention when male drinking caused domestic violence, financial irresponsibility, or neglect of family obligations that threatened household welfare. Some regions developed exceptions for women traveling on business, those with special licenses, or situations involving medical emergencies that required access to tavern facilities for practical rather than social purposes. The discrimination created alternative accommodation arrangements, including women-only establishments, religious hostels, and private household networks that provided lodging for female travelers excluded from standard commercial facilities. The exclusion rules varied by social class, with wealthy women gaining access through political connections, while poor women faced absolute prohibition regardless of their legitimate need for accommodation or refreshment. Some women circumvented restrictions through disguise, false documentation, or claiming religious status that provided exemptions from rules that applied to ordinary female travelers. The drinking intervention powers created legal frameworks that recognized women's legitimate interests in controlling male behavior that affected family welfare while maintaining overall male social dominance. The discrimination influenced broader gender relations by reinforcing male control over public spaces while providing limited female authority over domestic issues that affected household survival and prosperity. 91. Technological innovations. Advanced medieval inns featured private locked rooms, storage facilities, function rooms for hire, sophisticated cellars with international wine and beer collections, and the evolution from communal sleeping to private accommodations at dramatically different rates across regions. The private room development represented major architectural innovation because traditional in design emphasized communal spaces that maximize capacity, while private accommodations reduce profitability through decreased space utilization efficiency. Locking mechanisms were sophisticated engineering projects that required skilled metalworking and precise mechanical knowledge to create security systems that could protect valuable guest belongings and personal safety. The storage facilities included specialized areas for different types of goods, including temperature-controlled wine cellars, secure vaults for valuable items, and climate-managed spaces for textiles and other sensitive merchandise. Function room rental created additional revenue streams while providing community services for meetings, celebrations, and business activities that required private spaces unavailable in domestic settings. The international beverage collections demonstrated sophisticated supply chain management that brought wines from distant regions while maintaining quality through proper storage and handling techniques. The evolution toward private accommodations reflected changing customer expectations and increased wealth that allowed travelers to pay premium prices for privacy and security unavailable in traditional communal arrangements. Regional variations in technological adoption created competitive advantages for areas that invested in innovation, while traditional establishments in conservative regions lost customers to more advanced competitors. The technological improvements required substantial capital investment that was only justified by premium pricing and customer loyalty that generated sufficient revenue to cover enhanced facility costs. Modern hospitality technology still reflects medieval innovations that prioritize customer comfort, security, and service quality while balancing operational efficiency with enhanced amenities that commanded higher prices. 92. Secret Passage Networks. Many medieval inns featured extensive secret passage networks, with a mermaid and having tunnels connecting to other buildings and one running to the Old Bell, and featuring a revolving cupboard for smuggler escapes and criminal activity facilitation. The tunnel construction required sophisticated engineering knowledge and substantial capital investment that demonstrated the economic importance of activities that justified expensive underground infrastructure development. The passage networks served multiple purposes, including tax evasion, political conspiracy, criminal escape routes, and emergency evacuation during conflicts that threatened operators and their customers. The revolving cupboard design was a mechanical innovation that allowed rapid movement between buildings while maintaining concealment from authorities who might be monitoring conventional entrances and exits. Some passage systems connected inns to religious buildings, government facilities, or private residences that created complex networks for moving people and goods without detection by hostile authorities. The secret infrastructure required maintenance by specialized craftsmen who could be trusted with sensitive information about illegal activities while providing technical expertise for complex mechanical and architectural systems. Operators used passage networks to provide premium services for customers willing to pay extra for enhanced security privacy, and access to illegal activities, including smuggling and political conspiracy. The construction often involved multiple buildings and property owners who had to coordinate development while maintaining secrecy about infrastructure that could be used for various illegal purposes. Discovery of secret passages could result in serious legal consequences, including property confiscation, criminal prosecution, and political persecution that threatened everyone associated with illegal infrastructure development. Modern archaeological investigations continue to discover medieval secret passage networks that provide insights into historical criminal activity, political resistance, and the sophisticated engineering capabilities of medieval builders. 93. Extreme regional construction variations. English inns used wattle and daub with central courtyards. German inns used heavy timber framing with exposed grid patterns. Mediterranean inns featured flat roofs and thick walls. Scandinavian inns had steep pitched roofs for snow shedding, creating architectural diversity that reflected regional climate, available materials, and cultural preferences. The English courtyard design provided protected outdoor spaces for activities including animal care, food preparation, and social gathering, while offering defensive advantages during conflicts that threatened insecurity. German timber framing demonstrated sophisticated woodworking techniques that created durable structures while providing distinctive visual appearance that advertised German engineering capabilities to potential customers. Mediterranean flat roof construction reflected climate conditions that required heat management and water conservation, while providing additional space for activities including food storage and social gathering. Scandinavian steep roof design was essential for snow load management that prevented structural collapse while creating distinctive architectural profiles that identified Nordic construction techniques. The material variations reflected local resource availability, including different types of stone, wood, clay, and metal that influenced construction costs and architectural possibilities in different regions. Regional climate adaptations included heating systems, ventilation designs, and weather protection features that addressed specific environmental challenges while maintaining customer comfort standards. The cultural preferences created aesthetic differences that reflected regional artistic traditions, social values, and customer expectations that influenced architectural design decisions beyond purely functional considerations. Construction technique knowledge was closely guarded trade secret that created competitive advantages for regions that developed superior building methods, while limiting technological transfer between areas. The architectural diversity created distinct regional hospitality experiences that attracted travelers interested in experiencing different cultural environments while providing local identity that distinguished one region's inns from competitors. 94. Town investment ratios. By 1400, provincial capitals typically had 10 to 20 inns, market towns had 2 to 5, and small towns had 1 inn, representing massive capital investment, with most inns operating around 1600 already established by 1379, demonstrating the industry's rapid early development. The investment calculations reflected sophisticated urban planning that balanced accommodation supply with demand generated by different types of commercial activity, population density, and travel patterns that varied between urban centers. Provincial capitals required multiple inns because they served diverse customer bases, including government officials, international merchants, religious pilgrims, and local residents who needed accommodation for various business and social purposes. Market town and ratios reflected periodic demand spikes during market days and seasonal commercial activities that required sufficient capacity for temporary population increases while maintaining viability during quieter periods. The capital investment represented enormous financial commitments that required long-term planning and substantial risk tolerance because construction costs were high while success depended on unpredictable economic and political factors. The early establishment dates demonstrate that medieval entrepreneurs recognized hospitality industry opportunities and invested heavily in development before market saturation reduced profitability and increased competition. The investment patterns influenced urban development by creating economic clusters around and locations that attracted additional businesses while generating employment opportunities for hundreds of thousands of workers. Some regions experienced overinvestment that led to business failures and financial losses when accommodation supply exceeded demand generated by economic development that didn't materialize as expected. The establishment timeline shows that successful locations were identified and developed relatively quickly, with later entrants facing increased competition and reduced profitability in markets dominated by established operators. Modern hospitality industry development still reflects medieval precedents that emphasized early market entry, strategic location selection, and substantial capital investment in facilities that could generate long-term profitability. 95 multifunctional business centers. Medieval and simultaneously operated as accommodation providers, restaurants, warehouses, banks, meeting halls, political centers, and retail marketplaces, making them perhaps the most economically diverse businesses in medieval society while serving essential community functions. The accommodation function was often the least profitable aspect of an operations because room rental generated limited revenue compared to food service, banking, storage, and meeting facility rental that could command premium pricing. Restaurant services included not only meal provision, but also catering for special events, food storage for community use, and preparation facilities that residents could rent for personal cooking projects. Warehouse operations provided secure storage for merchants while offering inventory management, goods distribution, and shipping coordination that made ends crucial nodes in commercial supply chains. Banking services included currency exchange, credit provision, deposit storage, and bill of exchange facilities that made innkeepers among the most financially sophisticated business people in their communities. Meeting hall rental served local government, guild organizations, religious groups, and private parties while providing neutral venues for negotiations and dispute resolution that required impartial settings. Political center functions included information exchange, political organizing, government meeting spaces, and unofficial diplomacy that made ends crucial for political communication and coordination. Retail marketplace operations provided sales spaces for traveling merchants while offering permanent retail facilities for local craftsmen and farmers who needed access to customer bases beyond their immediate neighborhoods. The functional diversity created economic resilience because operators could adjust their focus based on seasonal demand, economic conditions, and competitive pressures while maintaining multiple revenue streams. Modern business development still reflects medieval precedents that emphasize diversification and community service integration that created sustainable enterprises capable of adapting to changing economic conditions. 96. Priest innkeepers. Many innkeepers were actually priests, lawyers, or nobles who entered the profession because of extraordinary profitability that often exceeded income from traditional elite pursuits, creating complex religious commercial relationships that challenged social expectations about appropriate occupations. The profitability attracted educated elites who brought sophisticated management skills, political connections, and social credibility that enhanced operations while generating wealth that exceeded traditional professional earnings. Priest innkeepers created theological tensions because their commercial activities often involved gambling, drinking, and sexual services that contradicted religious teachings while generating income that supported religious activities. The legal expertise provided by lawyer innkeepers created competitive advantages through superior contract negotiation, dispute resolution, and regulatory compliance that protected their businesses while providing valuable services to customers. Noble innkeepers used their political connections and social status to attract high-value customers while gaining access to capital and business opportunities unavailable to commoners operating similar establishments. The professional diversification reflected practical recognition that hospitality industry profits could exceed traditional elite income sources while providing social mobility opportunities for ambitious individuals. Some priest innkeepers attempted to maintain moral standards by prohibiting certain activities while accepting reduced profits in exchange for religious consistency that attracted customers seeking morally acceptable accommodations. The religious-commercial integration created unique hospitality environments that combined spiritual services with accommodation amenities while generating income that supported both commercial and religious activities. The social legitimacy provided by priest and noble involvement elevated in industry status while demonstrating that hospitality services were economically important and socially respectable businesses. Modern hospitality industry professionalism reflects medieval precedents established by educated elites who brought sophisticated business practices and social credibility to commercial accommodation services. 97. Universal foreign guest policies. Despite general xenophobia, medieval hospitality laws required innkeepers to accommodate foreign travelers, creating unique spaces where international mixing occurred in otherwise segregated societies while providing legal protections for vulnerable strangers. The accommodation requirements reflected practical recognition that international commerce depended on foreign merchant access to local accommodation, while diplomatic relationships required reciprocal hospitality arrangements between different political entities. The legal protections were often more extensive for foreign guests than for domestic travelers because violations could create international incidents that threatened political and commercial relationships between kingdoms and trading partners. Foreign travelers often paid premium prices for accommodation that included additional services such as interpreters, currency exchange, and cultural guidance that helped them navigate unfamiliar social and commercial environments. The international mixing created cultural exchange opportunities that influenced art, technology, language development, and social customs through direct contact between people from different regions and cultural backgrounds. Some inns specialized in serving particular nationalities or cultural groups, developing expertise in foreign customs, dietary requirements, and business practices that made them preferred destinations for international travelers. The accommodation duties created tensions with local populations who might resent resources being provided to foreigners, while domestic poor people faced exclusion from the same establishments. Inn operators often served as informal diplomats who facilitated communication between foreign visitors and local authorities while providing intelligence about international political and economic developments. The universal access policies influenced broader attitudes about international relations and cultural tolerance while providing practical frameworks for managing cultural differences in commercial settings. Modern international hospitality law still reflects medieval precedents that prioritized foreign guest protection and accommodation access, regardless of local prejudices or cultural tensions that might otherwise exclude international travelers. 98. Inn-based political intelligence. Innkeepers functioned as unwilling intelligence agents, monitoring political conversations and reporting suspicious activities to authorities, while their establishments remained hotbeds of political intrigue and revolutionary planning that threatened government stability. The intelligence gathering was often involuntary because authorities pressured inn operators to provide information about guest activities while threatening business licenses and personal safety for those who refused to cooperate. The monitoring requirements created complex moral dilemmas where innkeepers had to balance customer privacy with personal safety while maintaining business relationships that depended on discretion and trust. Political conversations in inns were often more candid than those in other settings because alcohol consumption and travel fatigue loosened tongues, while the temporary nature of relationships encouraged openness about controversial topics. The revolutionary planning attracted political dissidents who used in meetings to coordinate activities across regional boundaries, while taking advantage of an operator's reluctance to report customers who generated substantial revenue. Some innkeepers became skilled at managing political tensions by providing authorities with minimal information while protecting guests from serious consequences through selective reporting and strategic omissions. The intelligence networks created information flows that influenced government policy decisions while providing early warning about political opposition activities that threatened established authorities. And operators developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining plausible deniability about political activities while protecting themselves from accusations of sedition or treason that could result in severe punishment. The political surveillance created additional business risks because establishments known for political activities attracted government attention while losing customers who feared association with surveillance and potential legal consequences. Modern hospitality industry security practices still reflect medieval precedents that balanced customer privacy with law enforcement cooperation while attempting to maintain business viability in politically sensitive environments. 99. Sophisticated innkeeper networks. Successful innkeepers built networks of trusted colleagues across Europe who could be relied upon for complex financial transactions, goods storage, and information sharing, creating proto-international business partnerships that influenced commercial development. The network relationships were based on personal trust developed through repeated successful transactions, mutual recommendation systems, and shared risk arrangements that created economic interdependence between geographically distant business partners. Financial transactions included international currency exchange, credit arrangements, and investment partnerships that allowed capital to move across political boundaries while minimizing risks associated with theft, political confiscation, and currency devaluation. Goods storage networks provided secure facilities for merchant inventory while enabling complex shipping arrangements that could adapt to seasonal transportation limitations, political disruptions, and market demand variations. Information sharing included commercial intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and business opportunities that helped network members make informed decisions about pricing, routes, and investment strategies. The partnership arrangements often included mutual insurance systems where network members shared losses from theft, natural disasters, or political confiscation while providing collective security that individual operators couldn't achieve independently. Some networks developed standardized procedures for customer service, pricing, and quality control that created predictable accommodation experiences for travelers who used multiple establishments within the same partnership system. The international scope created competitive advantages for network members who could offer services including guaranteed accommodation, coordinated transportation, and integrated logistics that independent operators couldn't match. The trust relationships were maintained through regular communication, periodic meetings, and formal agreements that established procedures for dispute resolution and partnership management across cultural and political boundaries. Modern hospitality industry partnerships still reflect medieval precedents that emphasize trust-based relationships, mutual support systems, and coordinated service delivery that provided competitive advantages through international cooperation. 100 medieval in ghost folklore. Many medieval inns developed elaborate ghost stories used for marketing purposes, with the Mermaid Inn's Room 16 allegedly featuring one of the most well-organized ghostly scenarios anywhere, including duels between men in 16th century, clothing, and supernatural disappearances through trapdoors. The ghost marketing was sophisticated promotional strategy that attracted customers seeking supernatural experiences while creating distinctive brand identities that differentiated establishments from purely commercial competitors. The supernatural stories often reflected real historical events, including murders, political conspiracies, and tragic accidents that had occurred in buildings, providing entertainment value while maintaining connection to authentic historical experiences. Room 16's specific ghost scenario included detailed narratives about particular historical figures, specific time periods, and recurring supernatural events that created immersive experiences for guests seeking paranormal encounters. The trapdoor disappearances added dramatic elements to ghost stories while serving practical purposes for secret passages, escape routes, and hidden storage that enhanced both supernatural atmosphere and criminal functionality. Some ghost stories were deliberately cultivated by operators who hired storytellers, staged supernatural effects, and maintained atmospheric conditions that enhanced psychological impact while generating premium pricing for supposedly haunted accommodations. The marketing effectiveness depended on cultural beliefs about supernatural activity that made ghost stories credible entertainment, while providing psychological thrills that enhanced customer satisfaction and generated word-of-mouth advertising. The historical accuracy of ghost stories varied dramatically, with some based on documented events, while others were complete fabrications designed to create marketable, supernatural experiences for customers seeking unusual accommodations. The folklore development reflected broader medieval attitudes about supernatural activity that accepted ghost presence as normal while providing entertainment value that enhanced commercial hospitality experiences. Modern hotel ghost marketing still reflects medieval precedents that used supernatural atmosphere as promotional tools while creating distinctive customer experiences that commanded premium pricing through enhanced entertainment value. 101. In staff social stratification. Medieval inns employed complex hierarchies of staff, including gong farmers, rakers, ostlers, alewives, and various specialists, each with distinct social positions, wage structures, and living arrangements that reflected broader medieval social organization while creating internal workplace dynamics. Gong farmers occupied the lowest social position despite earning premium wages because their waste management work created social stigma that prevented integration with respectable society regardless of their economic success. Alewives held specialized positions that provided economic independence and social respect within and hierarchies, while facing broader gender discrimination that limited their opportunities in other commercial activities. Ostlers maintained crucial positions that combined animal care with security responsibilities, creating influence and respect that exceeded their formal wage levels while requiring specialized knowledge and physical capabilities. The wage structures reflected skill requirements, social acceptability, and market demand for different types of labor, while creating internal competition and advancement opportunities within an organizations. Living arrangements varied by social position, with higher status staff receiving better accommodation, while lower-ranked workers shared spaces or lived in conditions that reflected their social position within and hierarchies. The social stratification created internal conflicts and tensions that required management, while providing advancement opportunities for ambitious workers who could develop skills and social connections that improve their status. Some staff positions provided access to additional income through tips, side businesses, and corruption opportunities that could supplement official wages while creating informal economic relationships within an operations. The hierarchical systems reflected broader medieval social organization, while providing specialized roles that contributed to complex business operations requiring coordination between different types of skilled and unskilled workers. Modern hospitality industry employment still reflects medieval precedents that emphasized specialization, hierarchy, and social stratification while providing advancement opportunities through skill development and customer service excellence. 102. Economic impact on communities. Medieval inns generated enormous economic multiplier effects, with successful establishments supporting dozens of ancillary businesses, including brewers, bakers, blacksmiths, and entertainers, making them crucial engines of local economic development while creating employment networks. The multiplier effects extended far beyond direct employment because accommodation services required supply chains for food, beverages, construction materials, furnishings, and equipment that supported specialized craftsmen and agricultural producers. Brewing operations alone required grain suppliers, equipment manufacturers, and transportation services while generating waste products that supported agricultural activities through fertilizer provision and animal feed production. Food service operations created demand for local farmers, fishermen, butchers, and specialty food producers while providing markets for surplus agricultural production that might otherwise lack commercial outlets. Construction and maintenance activities supported carpenters, masons, metalworkers, and other craftsmen while requiring ongoing supply of building materials that created demand for quarries, forests, and manufacturing operations. Entertainment services provided income for musicians, storytellers, dancers, and other performers while creating cultural activities that enhance community life beyond purely economic benefits. The employment networks created by successful inns often included hundreds of direct and indirect workers who depended on hospitality industry success for their livelihoods, while contributing to broader economic prosperity. Some communities became economically dependent on operations that generated substantial tax revenue, while supporting population levels that exceeded what local agriculture alone could sustain. The economic development patterns created by an investment-influenced urban planning, transportation infrastructure, and commercial policy decisions that affected entire regions for centuries after initial establishment. Modern economic development still reflects medieval precedents that recognized hospitality industry potential for creating employment, supporting ancillary businesses, and generating economic growth that exceeded direct industry revenues. 103. International law development. Medieval and regulations contributed to early international law development as merchants demanded consistent treatment across political boundaries, leading to standardized practices that influenced modern commercial law while creating frameworks for international business relationships. The merchant demands reflected practical necessity for predictable treatment that reduced commercial risks while enabling long-distance trade that required accommodation services in multiple political jurisdictions. Standardization efforts included common liability rules, pricing regulations, and service standards that created consistency across different legal systems while providing merchants with legal protections that transcended local political authorities. The international frameworks required diplomatic negotiations between different kingdoms and political entities that established precedents for commercial treaty development and international dispute resolution mechanisms. Some standardization efforts created early forms of international arbitration where merchant disputes could be resolved through neutral procedures that avoided bias from local political interests that might favor domestic over foreign commercial interests. The legal development influenced broader international relations by creating commercial frameworks that required political cooperation while generating economic benefits that encouraged peaceful relationships between different political entities. The precedents established through and regulation influenced broader commercial law development, including contract enforcement, liability standards, and consumer protection that extended far beyond hospitality industry regulation. International merchant organizations played crucial roles in promoting standardization while providing collective bargaining power that individual merchants couldn't achieve when negotiating with political authorities in different jurisdictions. The legal frameworks created enforcement mechanisms that operated across political boundaries while establishing procedures for resolving conflicts between different legal systems that applied to commercial activities. Modern international commercial law still reflects medieval precedents that emphasize consistent treatment, predictable legal frameworks, and dispute resolution mechanisms that facilitated international business relationships across political and cultural boundaries. 104. Architectural preservation strategies. Medieval innkeepers developed sophisticated building maintenance techniques, including specialized treatments for different materials, pest control methods, and structural reinforcement strategies that enabled some inns to survive 700-plus years while demonstrating advanced engineering knowledge. The preservation techniques reflected substantial economic investment in building maintenance that was justified by the long-term profitability of successful inn operations while demonstrating sophisticated understanding of material science and structural engineering. Different materials required specialized treatments, including stone cleaning and repair, timber preservation and replacement, metal corrosion prevention, and roofing maintenance that required expertise from skilled craftsmen with detailed technical knowledge. Pest control methods included both chemical and physical approaches for managing insects, rodents, and other vermin that could damage building materials while creating health hazards for guests and staff members. Structural reinforcement strategies addressed foundation settling, wall deterioration, and roof stress while maintaining operational capacity that allowed continued business operations during maintenance and improvement activities. The 700-year survival record demonstrates exceptional building quality and maintenance practices that exceeded contemporary construction standards while creating economic value through sustained operational capacity. Some preservation techniques included preventive maintenance schedules, quality control procedures, and material testing methods that anticipated problems before they became serious threats to building integrity and business operations. The investment calculations balanced maintenance costs against operational revenue, while considering long-term property values that justified substantial expenditures for building preservation and improvement activities. The engineering knowledge required for effective preservation exceeded what many other medieval industries possessed, while demonstrating sophisticated technical capabilities that influenced broader construction and maintenance practices. Modern historic preservation still uses techniques and principles first developed by medieval innkeepers who created sustainable building maintenance approaches that maximize structural longevity while maintaining operational functionality. 105. Cultural exchange facilitation. Medieval inns served as crucial nodes for cultural exchange where different languages, customs, technologies, and ideas mixed, making them among the most important institutions for European cultural development and the spread of innovations across political and linguistic boundaries. The cultural mixing occurred through daily interactions between travelers from different regions who shared accommodation, meals, and social activities while exchanging information about their home cultures and local customs. Language exchange was particularly important because in environments provided intensive immersion experiences that helped travelers learn new languages while facilitating communication between people who spoke different native languages. Technology transfer included agricultural techniques, manufacturing methods, architectural innovations, and commercial practices that spread through Europe as travelers observed and adopted superior methods they encountered during their journeys. Ideas about politics, religion, philosophy, and social organization spread through in conversations that brought together people with different cultural perspectives while creating opportunities for intellectual exchange and debate. The innovation spread included musical styles, artistic techniques, literary forms, and entertainment practices that enriched European culture while creating synthesis between different regional traditions and cultural approaches. Some inns became recognized centers for particular types of cultural exchange, including scholarly discussions, artistic collaboration, or technological innovation that attracted people specifically seeking intellectual and creative stimulation. The cultural development influenced broader European integration by creating shared cultural elements that transcended political boundaries while facilitating communication and cooperation between different ethnic and linguistic groups. The exchange facilitation often occurred unconsciously through casual interactions rather than formal educational programs, making inns effective cultural development institutions that operated through natural social processes. Modern cultural exchange still reflects medieval precedents established in environments that demonstrated the effectiveness of informal cultural mixing for promoting innovation, tolerance, and intellectual development across diverse populations.